Hey guys, tonight we drift back into a time when your heartbeat had no business in the marriage market. You're not swiping right. You're not locking eyes across a candlelit table. You're a pawn. A pretty one maybe, but a pawn nonetheless. It's a damp morning in a village that no longer exists on any modern map. The chickens are clucking, the bread is hard, and someone's mother is arguing over how many goats you're worth. You're not even awake yet, and already your future's been traded like a sack of barley. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up knowing you won't choose who you marry. Not now. Not in this world. Not in this era. Marriage, this sacred, romantic, deeply personal thing in your mind, isn't really yours to direct. It belongs to your parents, or your clan, or the man who owns the largest granary in town. You can imagine love all you want, but when it comes time to kneel at the altar, it'll be someone else's decision who kneels beside you. Because for most of history, marriage had nothing, absolutely nothing to do with your feelings. It had everything to do with money, land, alliances, and social stability. It was a transaction sealed by handshakes and bloodlines. You, dear sleeper, with a receipt, if you were lucky, maybe your future spouse didn't smell like wet leather. But honestly, that wasn't the priority. The priority was, will this union produce heirs, merge estates, secure peace between rival families, or elevate social rank? And it didn't matter if you were noble or poor. The game was just as rigged, only with different tokens. The upper class married for political advantage. The lower class for economic survival. A marriage meant joining farms, strengthening kinship ties, or simply ensuring there were enough hands to pull weeds and churn butter. You walk through the mud path toward the village green, and already whispers trail behind you. Your parents have been in quiet negotiations for months. There's a boy whose father owns 3 cows, not 2, 3. Everyone agrees he's quite a catch. Your personal thoughts on the matter? Unimportant. In ancient Mesopotamia, marriages were arranged via detailed contracts. These weren't mere love letters, they were binding agreements, complete with financial penalties. If a bride failed to produce children, for instance, she might be sent back like defective merchandise. Historians still argue whether such arrangements were purely transactional or whether there was ever space for affection in these strict systems. And then there's ancient China, where family honor and Confucian duty bound sons and daughters into betrothals chosen by their elders. The idea of disobeying this sacred structure, practically treasonous. Your body might be yours, but your marriage, that belongs to the family ledger. You may fantasize about love in the wild meadows with a boy who carves flutes from pine, but instead you're being measured like cattle at the local fair. Your hips, strong enough to bear children. Your skin, light enough for social mobility. Your personality, irrelevant unless it comes with good teeth. In medieval Europe, marriage was one of the few tools to consolidate power without raising a sword. If you could marry your daughter to the son of your enemy, boom, instant peace treaty and maybe a shared vineyard. The only people who maybe got to marry for affection were widows. Once their first husband died, and let's be honest, they often did, they occasionally had the freedom to choose their next mate. But even then it was risky. If she chose too low or too quickly, she might be branded loose or foolish. You sit at the family table, sipping something warm and bitter, listening to your father list the merits of a man whose only known talent is owning shoes without holes. And you think, is this it? But yes, this is it. Until very recently in human history, this was the norm. Love was suspicious. Love was dangerous. Love threatened the order of things. To marry for love meant giving emotion the reins in a world obsessed with control. And if you think this sounds dramatic, well, in some places, trying to marry for love literally got people killed. Romeo and Juliet may be fiction, but the sentiment was rooted in truth. In Renaissance Italy, disobeying your family's matchmaking plans wasn't romantic. It was reckless and punishable. Even your wedding ceremony, what you picture now as a big, white, joyful affair, was often just a somber transfer of ownership, a formal passing of the torch from one patriarch to another. Here's my daughter. She's your problem now. Don't forget her linen chest. Of course, not every culture treated marriage exactly the same. Anthropologists have found groups, like some indigenous communities, where marriage was more egalitarian, or where love played a more central role. But they were exceptions, not the rule. And while you lie there imagining running away with someone your heart actually chooses, remember that the legal ability to do that, very, very new. In many places, women couldn't even own property until the late 1800s. So choosing to marry for love, that wasn't just emotional risk, it was economic suicide. You'd be leaving behind the only system that promised you food, shelter, and protection for a maybe that this one boy wouldn't turn out to be terrible. Even today, some countries still hold tight to arranged marriages, and while some modern versions are collaborative and consensual, the old version, not so much. You sigh, the stars are out, the fire's low, and you realize if you'd been born just a few centuries earlier, your love story wouldn't be yours to write. Your marriage wouldn't be a romantic choice. It would be a contract, a trade, and maybe, if you're lucky, a tolerable roommate arrangement. You turn on your side, wrapping your blanket tighter as the flicker of history dances behind your eyes. Sleep tight. Your wedding is scheduled for next Tuesday. You wake the next morning not to a gentle caress or a whispered good morning, but to the clink of coin and the scent of ink drying on parchment. Because today you learn that love, at least in your world, isn't just impractical. It's dangerous, a liability, a risk no one in their right mind would encourage. The birds are chirping, sure, but so is the town gossip. Word has spread that someone in the neighbouring village tried to marry for love last spring, eloped with a baker's apprentice no less. Her family disowned her. She's now living in a lean-to by the river, and rumour has it, her husband still smells like flour and failure. Love stories in this world often don't end with weddings. They begin with weddings arranged by fathers and sealed by land grants, and they end in quiet misery, scandalous affairs, or the occasional duel. Falling in love before marriage, that's the stuff of poems. Falling in love after marriage, that's luck, because love complicates things. If you marry for affection, what happens when that affection fades? Or worse, when it clouds your judgment? You might pick someone charming but financially unstable, handsome but politically useless, kind but with no dowry, no cattle, and no chance of strengthening your family's position. And then what? The whole family suffers. In the Byzantine Empire, aristocratic marriages were arranged like international treaties. If a princess married a noble with no clout, she wasn't just disappointing her parents. She was destabilizing the entire imperial court. Historians still argue whether Emperor Constantine's niece fell in love with a minor noble or whether the entire romance was fabricated to mask a political blunder. You walk past the town square where two fathers argue over the terms of a betrothal like they're haggling over a horse. They laugh, spit in their palms, shake hands. Somewhere nearby, the future bride weeps softly behind a shuttered window. You see, in most eras, love was treated like a wild animal, beautiful to look at, thrilling in a poem, but not something you let loose in polite society. Certainly not in the realm of contracts and dynasties. In ancient India, the Manusmriti, the influential legal text, outlined very specific guidelines about marriage, often favouring unions within one's caste and community. Falling in love across caste lines, that wasn't romantic. It was subversive, dangerous, often punishable, and very, very messy. Even in classical Greece, where philosophers mused about the nature of the soul, marriage was less about the joining of hearts and more about producing legitimate heirs. The idea of loving your wife was almost suspicious. Real affection, they believed, was reserved for friendships or, more controversially, mentorships with younger men. You look down at your hands, still sore from hauling water, and wonder if anyone ever tried to challenge the system. Some did, but they rarely succeeded. The problem wasn't just tradition, it was infrastructure. Marriage was the foundation upon which entire social and economic systems were built. Love threatened that. Love said, well, I don't care if this alliance benefits my family. I want him or her, or occasionally neither. And societies didn't like that, so love was compartmentalized, moved to the realm of fiction. Romantic stories like Tristan and Isolde or Lancelot and Guinevere were wildly popular but always tragic, always ending in death, exile or madness, because that was the cautionary tale. Stray from duty and you will suffer. You feel a breeze and close your eyes. In this world, the word marriage is not associated with butterflies or candlelight. It's a ledger entry, a signature, a locked gate. Some cultures even used astrology to determine matches. In medieval Islamic societies, astrologers were sometimes consulted to ensure celestial compatibility, not love compatibility. Star charts weren't used to confirm you'd laugh at each other's jokes. They were used to predict fortune, fertility, and family prosperity. In Japan, during the Edo period, marriages were brokered by nakodo, or matchmakers, who carefully selected matches based on family status, income, and yes, occasionally personality. But that last factor ranked very low on the list. If you lived during this time and your heart fluttered for someone from the wrong background, you had two options: forget it or keep it secret forever. A fringe tidbit? In medieval France, love potions were so common they became a legitimate concern for the church. Some women even carried dried toad skin or crushed beetles, hoping to ensnare a partner's heart. Historians still debate whether these potions ever worked, or if they just offered hope in a hopeless system. You shuffle home past the chapel where a couple is being wed. The bride is trembling, not from joy, from the weight of what's ahead. She met the groom 5 days ago. He smells faintly of onions and arrogance. You wonder if they'll grow to tolerate each other. Perhaps. Many did. Some even developed affection. Not quite the sweeping, dramatic love you imagine from novels, but a comfortable companionship. A steady hand across the back, a shared routine. Sometimes that was enough. And still you dream of more. You think of how dangerous it would be to let your heart guide you, how ruinous, how selfish. And yet you still imagine doing it, because deep down, even in this cold, transactional world, the ember of desire glows. You want to love and to be loved, not just chosen, but in this time and place, you'd be wise to hide that little ember deep within, out of sight, out of reach. Tuck it under your ribcage and carry on, because love, for now, is not your currency. It's your burden. Today, you don't wake with dreams of romance. You wake with numbers in your head, not love poems or whispered sweet nothings, but the weight of dowries, the size of estates, the value of your body translated into coin, cattle, or, if you're unlucky, fine linens. Because now you learn the full cost of being a daughter. It's not just that you can't choose your husband. It's that you come with a price tag. Or, depending on the culture, you are the price. Step into your slippers and prepare for a delicate balancing act, one where your worth is itemized, negotiated and bargained over, all before you've had your breakfast. In some regions, a dowry was expected, money or property from the bride's family, to help set up the new household, and often to compensate the groom's side for taking on this new responsibility. In others, it was the reverse, a bride price, paid by the groom's family in exchange for your hand. Either way, someone's paying for you, and you have no say in the transaction. In medieval Italy, dowries were tracked in account books with the same gravity as a vineyard's harvest or a merchant's profits. A daughter with a smaller dowry might not marry at all. She might be shipped off to a convent, not for piety, but because no one could afford to marry her off properly. Historians still argue whether the explosion of nunneries in 14th century Florence was driven by devotion or by economics. You walk through your family's home and notice the silences, the worried glances. Your father is running numbers. Your mother is stitching embroidery with quiet desperation, because if they can't muster enough for your dowry, you don't get a wedding. You get a wimple and a vow of silence. That embroidery, it's not a hobby, it's a sales pitch. And if you are from a family that expects a bride price instead, your fate isn't much better. It means you've officially become livestock. There's no elegant way to say it. Your value has been tabulated in oxen or gold coins, and the richer your suitor, the more say he has in your future. A fringe example? Among certain African communities in pre-colonial times, bride wealth could involve items as curious as bundles of salt, hand-forged knives, or even musical instruments. Payments symbolic of alliance, respect, and economic promise. But no matter the form, cash, cattle, or kettle drums, the meaning remained. Your life was a transaction, an exchange between men. You sit by the hearth as your older sister's betrothal is finalized. She's only 15. Her fiancé is 37, with a red beard and a face like spoiled cream. But his estate borders your father's land, and the union promises security. Your sister doesn't cry. She just smooths her dress and stares into the fire. She knows the game, because being a daughter in most historical societies meant you were someone else's investment, a tool, a gamble, a way to gain favor, avoid war, merge fortunes, or settle debts. In some parts of ancient Rome, the dowry didn't just go to the husband, it could be reclaimed by the wife's family if he divorced her. Which added a curious twist. Sometimes marriages were held together not by affection, but by the legal threat of losing money. Your parents aren't cruel, they're trapped. Just like you, the system has existed longer than your bloodline. To rebel against it would mean ruin, exile, or worse, shame. You try to imagine a world where you could say no, just say no, but here, no isn't an answer, it's a scandal. In 17th century England, contracts often described women as given, taken, or bestowed, never choosing. Legal documents read like grocery receipts, and you, darling listener, were listed beneath the sheep. There were exceptions, of course, brave ones, mad ones. Some daughters refused the match and fled. Some lovers ran away with nothing but hope and a bad plan. Some families, especially among the middle class during the Enlightenment, began to consider mutual affection as a pleasant bonus. But these were outliers, soft whispers against a centuries-long roar of economic necessity. And it wasn't just about securing the bride. Your new family would examine you like a prized piece of livestock. Were you fertile-looking? Had you been raised to obey? Could you sew, cook, and bear sons without dying too early? And if you didn't perform well in these roles, your dowry could sometimes be used against you, returned, reduced, or demanded back. You weren't just a gift, you were a gamble, a quirky bit. In parts of medieval Eastern Europe, if a bride was found not to be a virgin on her wedding night, the groom's family could demand a partial refund on the dowry. Yes, a refund. As though you were a slightly damaged vase. The sheer audacity of it might make your sleepy mind wince. But that was the world. Even today, echoes of this practice linger in parts of the world. Dowry-related violence, expectations of extravagant gifts, pressure on families to marry off daughters quickly before their value decreases with age. You lie back on your straw mattress and stare at the rafters. Somewhere out there, someone's writing your name next to a number. Somewhere out there, your future husband is considering your price. He doesn't know you, he doesn't love you, but he might buy you anyway. And the truly absurd part? No one around you sees anything wrong with this, because you, child of history, are a daughter. And daughters don't marry for love, they marry for leverage. This morning, you're not brushing your hair in hopes of a spark. You're being prepared like a chess piece, nudged across a board you don't control. Today, you're being told about the land, not the person, not the romance, the land, because in the world you've woken into, a marriage isn't the start of a love story, it's the final clause in a land contract. And oh, what a contract it is. You sit in a drafty stone hall as two lords, your father and your future father-in-law, debate your fate. There's a goat-haired map on the table between them. One scratches his beard. The other points to a little square of meadow right between the hedgerow and the stream. That's the spot. That's what this entire marriage is about. Not you. The meadow. In feudal Europe, Marriage among the landed classes was a legal tool, a way to consolidate territories without ever raising a sword. Why conquer after all when you can simply marry the neighbour's daughter and inherit it all in a generation? You, dear dreamer, are that inheritance. You might be 14 or 15. Your future husband, 28 or 58, he might smell like cloves and sweat. He might call you my little hedge patch. You might not even speak the same dialect. But his father has land that borders your father's grain field, and if those two fields become one, that's fewer fences to maintain, fewer borders to patrol, and, most importantly, more leverage at court. A classic historical example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in medieval Europe, was married off to Louis VII of France when she was just 15. Their marriage had less to do with personal connection and more to do with the 500 miles of lush territory she brought with her. Historians still argue whether Louis ever truly loved her, but everyone agrees he married her for Aquitaine. You tug at the sleeves of your formal tunic as your mother fixes your veil. She says nothing about love. Instead, she says, "Ritzi, remember to smile and don't speak unless asked." And so you nod and smile and stay silent, because in this world, your voice isn't needed, your name barely matters. What matters is that your dowry includes a stretch of fertile soil and a flock of sheep. You are, in essence, a boundary marker with a beating heart. Quirky historical footnote. In 12th century France, noble families sometimes included trees in their marriage contracts. Yes, trees, specific ones. The chestnut grove by the southern ridge shall pass to the husband, as if you were being traded along with a patch of oaks. You imagine yourself standing on that ridge, alone, the wind in your hair. The kind of place where someone might whisper, "Run away with me." But no one is whispering, only legal terms now. Even in lower classes, marriage could be used to secure access to small plots of communal land, especially in villages with complex land-sharing systems. Peasant marriages weren't grand, but they still came with expectations. Marry the girl from the next village, and suddenly you can graze your goats on better pasture. You shift in your chair at the betrothal ceremony. The priest drones on, but you're watching the steward in the corner. He's keeping track of who owns what now. He's more important than the flower girl, because love doesn't factor into soil. Your future father-in-law toasts with ale, claps your shoulder like he's just bought a new plough, and congratulates your father on a fine alliance. You are officially a human fence post, and yet people do smile at you. They call you lucky. They say the match is good, respectable, stable. No one asks if you're happy, and in truth you're not even sure what that would look like. Marriage is a duty to blood, land, name, and lineage, a duty to keep estates intact, to produce heirs, to stitch together scattered fields into one coherent estate that your sons will inherit. Sons, not you. You'll just be mother of heirs, tucked into the margins of the deed, and heaven help you if you fail to produce any. Among the landed elite, a barren wife could be sent back to her family or quietly set aside in favour of a more fertile option. Set aside was such a pleasant euphemism, wasn't it? It made you sound like a trinket in a drawer. You wander the manor grounds after the feast. The land you've just brought into the family is lovely, rolling hills, sheep dots a crooked apple tree, but it doesn't feel like yours, not even a little, because you weren't allowed to choose this life. You were bartered for it. A scholar once described feudal marriages as contracts with ceremonial frosting. The frosting was the feast, the music, the garlands of flowers. The contract? That was the true heart of the affair. In your quiet, sleepy world, love was not the glue that held households together. It was barely a whisper. It might come later, of course, after years of shared duties and quiet companionship. Some couples even grew fond of one another, not because of romantic beginnings, but through proximity, familiarity, habit. But that wasn't required, and certainly not expected. You sit beside your new husband at the table. He nods politely, chewing on roast partridge. He thanks your father for the land. Then he turns to you and says, "You'll make a good mother, I think." That's it. That's the courtship. You nod, smile, and sip your wine. Outside, the wind rustles the chestnut grove. You wonder if your name has been carved into the trees along with the new family crest. Probably not. You're not the legacy. Just the merger. The sun rises over your thatched roof, and today you learn that being poor doesn't mean you get to marry for love either. Sorry. It just means you don't get any land in the bargain. No estates. No border treaties, no embroidered dowries, just the same old script, different props. Because even among peasants, even among those living hand-to-mouth in dirt-floored cottages, marriage was rarely about affection. It was still about labour, survival and convenience. A practical agreement to keep you alive, not make you swoon. You stretch and yawn beside a straw mattress. Your parents are already up, whispering about old Tom's son from the next village over. He's got strong arms, a healthy goat, and crucially, he's only missing one tooth. He's not handsome, but he can carry firewood without wheezing. That's romantic, in its own grim way. In medieval villages, marriages were often arranged, or at the very least, strongly encouraged, between families that needed to share resources. If your family had a daughter and a surplus of chickens, and your neighbour had a son and access to a well then, how about a wedding? There were no estate maps or Latin contracts here, just a handshake, maybe a nod from the village priest, and a general sense that you two will do. But make no mistake, you still didn't get to choose freely. Parental approval wasn't optional. In many European peasant communities, young couples couldn't marry without their parents' blessing. If they tried to marry on their own, they could be ostracized or denied church recognition, which mattered because without that approval, your children might be considered illegitimate, and that was not a good start in life. And if you think runaway marriage sounds exciting, it mostly just meant shame, fines, or a rushed ceremony in a chilly field with no witnesses and zero snacks. You help your mother grind grain while she hums an old tune, a love ballad about a shepherdess who married the man who caught her heart under a blossoming tree. It's a sweet song, completely fictional. You ask, did that ever happen in real life? She snorts, only in ballads. In truth, marriage at your station was rarely a one-on-one negotiation. It was more like a team draft. Families considered who could contribute what: tools, livestock, work ethic, strong hips, a solid back. If you were a good match physically and financially, emotions were a luxury no one discussed. A quirky historical tidbit? In that 16th century Germany, local officials often had to approve peasant marriages, ensuring both parties had sufficient means to support a household. If you were too poor, too young, or didn't own a pig, no marriage for you. Bureaucracy, the ultimate romance killer. You finish baking flatbread, the kitchen smoky with ash, and think about Tom's son again. He's polite, he laughs at your jokes, but he also smells like cabbage. And he once threw a dead squirrel at your cousin. Still, he's got a sturdy roof and 2 strong hands. That may be enough, because in your world, no one marries to complete each other. They marry to complete a chore list. And your family has expectations, and you're nearly 16 now. You can pluck chickens, mend socks, and lift a bucket without spilling. That makes you prime marital material. You remember how the local wise woman said once, "Love comes after the cow's been milked." Some couples grew fond of each other. Some even shared moments of affection, fingers brushing while gathering turnips, maybe a quiet laugh while patching holes in the roof. But it wasn't the stuff of sweeping gestures or long, heartfelt gazes. You might not even know your spouse very well before the wedding. A few visits, a dance at the harvest feast, maybe one slightly awkward conversation about the best place to catch eels. And yet, once the deal was made, it was final. In most cases, divorce wasn't even an option. You knew that marriage meant waking beside the same person, day after day, with no escape clause, unless they died. And even then you might be remarried within a season, like a rusty pot passed to a new hearth. And what about love? What about passion? Well, that was what songs were for. Songs and whispered stories. The story of the girl who married the woodsman she truly loved. the boy who defied his father's wishes to wed the baker's daughter, the couple who carved their names into the bark of an elm before vanishing into the forest. These tales were retold around fires and in taverns. They were comforting, but they were cautionary too, because in almost every version, the lovers suffer, they starve, they're cast out. One dies tragically in a snowstorm. The message is clear. Love is thrilling, yes, but it doesn't keep the thatch on your roof. You pass old Tom's son by the well. He nods, you nod, and you both keep walking. Maybe that's the most affection you'll get before your parents shake on it. Because love is soft, fleeting, but firewood is forever. You wake before dawn to the smell of boiling porridge and the sound of boots stomping across the floorboards. It's your wedding day, or someone else's, but you can't tell if that knot in your stomach is nerves or hunger. Not that it matters. Either way, you don't get a say. Because today, you learn just how optional consent used to be. The idea that two people should both want to marry each other, that's a charming modern notion. For most of history, the very concept of mutual consent in marriage was either misunderstood, manipulated, or ignored altogether. You sit at the edge of the bed, lacing your shoes. Outside, a priest is warming his hands, not for a blessing, for a transaction. Throughout the medieval world, especially in Europe, the Catholic Church began to insist that valid marriages required consent, but here's the catch, that consent could be declared verbally, in private, and didn't even need witnesses, which, predictably, created chaos. Young people could declare their love in secret and be considered married under canon law. But if their families objected? Oh well, the marriage was still technically valid, unless, of course, someone argued it wasn't, or paid someone else to say otherwise. In practice, though, even the Church's insistence on free will was blurry. Parents pressured, communities nudged, lords and landowners demanded. And let's be blunt, if you were a woman in almost any era before the 20th century, your consent was theoretical, at best. You might nod out of fear, you might stay silent, and silence would be taken as yes. You might cry and be told to dry your tears because you'll learn to love him. You might beg and be told that obedience was your duty. A grim example? In many cultures, including parts of Renaissance Italy and France, girls as young as 12 could be legally married, some even younger. Historians still argue whether these early unions were always consummated immediately or delayed until puberty, but the reality remains a child's nod was enough. You walk through the chapel with cold feet, literally and metaphorically. Your fiancé is smiling. You are trying. The priest asks if you consent. You whisper yes, because what else can you say? No would shame your parents. No would ruin the deal. No would make you a problem. A historical oddity. In some Eastern European folk traditions, refusal was expressed by throwing down a ceremonial goblet or turning one's back at the altar. These gestures had to be very clear because ambiguity could doom you to a lifetime commitment based on an awkward shrug. In the Ottoman Empire, Islamic marriage law technically required consent from both parties, but loopholes abounded. A male guardian could speak on a woman's behalf. And sometimes, if the bride remained silent, it was interpreted as agreement. Yes, silence could be legally binding. So you see, in theory, you had a voice. In practice, it was muffled, choked, coaxed. A fringe example. In 19th century Bengal, some child brides were married in ceremonies while still toddlers. The idea of consent was moot. The child wouldn't even remember the ceremony. Later, she'd move into her husband's household and be expected to accept her role, no questions asked. You lean against the window watching smoke rise from chimneys, and you wonder how many women in your village were truly asked. Not just told, not gently threatened, but actually honestly asked. You suspect the number is low because for most of human history, obedience masqueraded as consent. You think about the stories you've heard. The girl who tried to run away and was dragged back by her hair. The boy who loved a farmhand but was forced to marry a merchant's daughter. The couple caught holding hands in a field who were separated and punished for daring to feel something unapproved. And all the while, official records stated the same thing: consented. But did they? Your hands tremble as you fold a scrap of linen, your veil maybe, a dowry token, a surrender flag. You remember what your aunt once said: the happiest wives are the ones who keep quiet and get on with it. You don't know if she believed that, but she said it often enough that it stuck like porridge to the pan. In many ancient societies, consent was further complicated by ownership. Women were considered the property of their fathers until they became the property of their husbands. You weren't asked to choose, you were transferred. It's only in the last century or two that laws in various countries have begun to require clear, age-appropriate and independent consent. And even now, in some corners of the world, that battle isn't over. You sigh, looking out at the fields. You wonder what it would feel like to be asked, and to answer freely. To say yes, not because you're supposed to, but because you want to. To look someone in the eye and say, "I choose you," and have them say the same back. But in this era, in this world, that's not your script. You play your part. You say the words. You smile in the wedding portrait, even if the smile is stitched on like embroidery. You didn't choose this life, but it's yours now. And tomorrow you'll rise with him. You'll pour water into his basin. You'll learn his rhythms and habits like memorizing a stranger's song. Maybe, over time, something like affection will grow, or maybe not, but either way, your consent is no longer required. You wake to bells this morning, soft and distant, tolling through fog, church bells, not for you, but for someone else. A wedding, most likely. Or a christening. Or both, if things happened in the wrong order. You wrap a shawl over your shoulders and step outside into the damp, knowing today is one of those days where religion starts to show up, not to protect love, but to control it. Because now you learn how the church stepped in, muddied the waters, and made marriage even more complicated. You'd think that with all its incense and sacred vows, religion would have elevated marriage into a holy union of souls, and to an extent it tried. But in truth, the church didn't invent marriage. It inherited it, then spent centuries trying to clean it up. By the time Christianity began gaining momentum in the Roman Empire, marriage was already an established civic practice, tangled up with dowries, inheritances, and social contracts. The early church didn't outlaw those things. It just added new layers, sacraments, ceremonies, and rules. Lots of rules. In the early Middle Ages, marriage didn't even require a priest. Two people could exchange vows in front of witnesses, or even alone, and be considered married under canon law. That whole speak now or forever hold your peace thing, it wasn't about romantic objections. It was a legal safety net to make sure no one was already married or closely related. But by the 12th century, the Catholic Church had decided that marriage was a holy sacrament on par with baptism and communion. And once something becomes holy, it also becomes regulated. You sit in the pew listening to a bishop read from a Latin scroll. He declares that marriage must be monogamous, heterosexual, and indissoluble. A word you don't quite understand, but that basically means no backsides. So now it's not just your family insisting you marry for duty, it's God. And if things go wrong, tough. Divorce wasn't an option in most of medieval Christendom. The best you could hope for was an annulment, a declaration that your marriage had never truly existed. But to get one, you'd have to prove something dramatic, that you were too closely related, that one of you was already married to someone else, or that you never consummated the union. Even then, your case would sit in a church court for months, maybe years. A historical case that still fascinates scholars? King Henry VIII's infamous request to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He claimed their union was invalid because she had previously been married to his brother. The church said no, so Henry shrugged, created his own church, and married Anne Boleyn instead. Problem solved, sort of. You pull your shawl tighter as the wind picks up. It's cold, and the chapel's stone walls aren't built for comfort, but the marriage ceremony happening inside will follow the same script as every other one this year: blessings, vows, and a kiss that means permanence, not passion. because now the church is involved in who you marry, how you marry, and what happens if it goes badly. And not just in Europe, in many parts of the Islamic world, religious courts governed marriage too. While Islamic law technically allowed divorce, it often placed the power firmly in the hands of men. A man could divorce his wife by repeating talaq 3 times. A woman? She had to petition the court, present evidence, and pray for sympathy. Even in Protestant communities where the Reformation shook up religious control, marriage still remained under the Church's watchful eye. Reformers like Martin Luther insisted marriage was a civil matter, but still one infused with divine purpose, and still very, very controlled. You step away from the chapel, past the mossy gravestones, and consider how many lives have been shaped or ruined by vows spoken under duress, or ceremony performed without love. Because once religion took control of marriage, it wasn't just about land or cattle anymore. It was about virtue, obedience, and eternity. A fringe example? In medieval Ireland, some folk traditions blended church rites with older Celtic customs. A couple might say their vows at a sacred well, then receive a priestly blessing later. Historians still argue whether these blended practices were tolerated or quietly condemned. You head back to your cottage and light a fire. Your mother tells you the bishop denied a local couple their annulment because the husband's impotence wasn't proven. She shakes her head. The wife has no recourse. She's stuck in a marriage that's both loveless and childless, with no hope of escape. The church may have claimed to sanctify marriage, but it also fortified it against you. Once bound, your only salvation was through suffering with grace. And yet, paradoxically, religion also gave marriage some protection. By placing it under divine watch, it became harder for parents to casually trade daughters like coins or to separate spouses on a whim. The rules were unfair, yes, but they were rules, which was something. And sometimes, just sometimes, a priest might refuse to bless a marriage if he believed the bride had been forced. A rare flicker of agency in a system built on control. You lie down by the fire and close your eyes, listening to the echoes of hymns and footsteps. The wedding bells have stopped. The bride and groom are on their way home now, hand in hand. Perhaps strangers, perhaps friends, perhaps neither. But their union is now holy, which means it's also irreversible. And you think, maybe the altar isn't a threshold, maybe it's a cage. You wake to the creak of the wooden floorboards and the smell of yesterday's bread warming by the hearth. Your sister is humming softly, something you haven't heard in a while. She's been married for 2 years now, not to the boy she hoped for. But oddly enough, she seems okay. And today, as you sip a lukewarm cup of broth, you wonder something you've never dared to ask out loud. Can arranged marriages actually work? Because as it turns out, sometimes they did. Not all loveless unions remained miserable. Not every bride wept into her embroidery, and not every groom kept a mistress in the next village over. Occasionally, quietly, affection bloomed. It wasn't fast, it wasn't fiery, but it was real. You step outside and see your neighbour couple tending the garden together. She's tugging weeds while he mends a fence. They bicker a little, laugh a little, then fall into the kind of easy silence that only comes from years of synchronized chores. They weren't in love when they married, but they are fond. And in this world, fondness is nothing to sneeze at. The truth is, long before Hollywood gave us slow-motion reunions and orchestral swells, most marriages began with shared duties, not butterflies. You were thrown into life with someone and had no choice but to make it work. Over time, a bond could form. You saw each other at your worst, sick, grumpy, covered in pig muck, and still got up the next day to do it all again, together. That kind of intimacy forged over firewood and fieldwork had its own strange beauty. A mainstream historical fact? In 18th century Japan, especially among merchant families, arranged marriages were common, but letters between spouses showed deep mutual respect and even tenderness. Some couples wrote poetry to each other, not because they were star-crossed lovers, but because they had grown into something warm and quiet. Your aunt used to say, "Love is like mould. It grows in the damp corners when no one's looking. Not the most flattering metaphor, but surprisingly accurate. A fringe tidbit. In some rural parts of Scandinavia, newlyweds were expected to live with the bride's parents for a year before setting up their own household. This trial period allowed families to ensure the couple was compatible, or at least could tolerate each other without throwing ladles. If things went truly badly, the marriage could sometimes be dissolved quietly before it became official. Historians still argue whether this was a progressive system or just a clever way to avoid wedding expenses. You help your sister gather laundry and notice the way her husband brings her a cup of water without being asked. No dramatic declarations, no grand romance, just the tiny gesture of someone who's paying attention. That's something, isn't it? Of course, for every story like this, there were others. Plenty of couples lived in silence, resentment, or worse. But not all arranged marriages were prisons. Some were simply gardens, not wildflowers, but vegetables, reliable, necessary, occasionally nourishing. The notion that love must precede marriage is a fairly new idea. For most of human history, love wasn't expected. If it arrived later, it was a bonus, like finding a second yolk in your egg. Nice, but not required. And in some cultures, people believed love that grew inside marriage was safer than love that exploded before it. The former was sturdy, the latter, wild and unstable. You think back to that shepherd boy who made your stomach flip when you were 13. He had a crooked smile and no prospects. He once fell into a ditch, chasing a chicken. You'd have married him in a heartbeat. And now you imagine life with him. Cold, hungry, chaotic. Your actual husband? Predictable, thoughtful, very into cheese. Not exciting, but not terrible. You stir the stew pot and realize with a jolt that you miss him when he's away, or maybe not in the sighing at the window kind of way, but in the who's going to fix the hinge kind of way, in the this joke isn't as funny if he's not here to hear it kind of way. Maybe that's its own kind of love, and maybe, just maybe, the absence of choice forced people to dig deeper, to find meaning in companionship rather than passion, to make the best of what they had rather than pine for what they were never promised. It's not romantic, but it's real. You watch as your neighbor kisses his wife on the forehead. She swats him with a towel, pretending to be annoyed. He laughs, she laughs, and in that moment, you wonder if they had butterflies at their wedding. Probably not. But they have something now, something steady, something kind. You close your eyes and drift, and for the first time in a long time, you feel peaceful. Because maybe love isn't always a lightning strike. Sometimes it's just a warm bowl of stew waiting for you after a long day in the rain. You wake slowly to the soft sound of wind pushing through shutters and the creak of timbers settling around you. The fire's out. The coals are cold. You pull the blanket tighter, and for a moment you imagine waking up beside someone who chose you because they couldn't help it, because they were in love. And then you remember that's not how this world works, because here, love is dangerous, love is foolish, love is, most of all, unrealistic. If it's anywhere, it's tucked inside poems, hiding in song lyrics, or whispered between two people who are absolutely not supposed to be alone together. In fact, if someone around here says the word romance, it usually ends badly, because now you learn something hard and sharp. Real love was for stories, not for real life. You pull on your boots and walk into the early morning air. A few townspeople are already out sweeping steps and feeding hens. You nod to the butcher's son. He doesn't nod back. You're not supposed to be seen talking to him. His family's poor, his background unclear, and worst of all, he once gave you a wildflower. That sort of thing? Scandalous. In courtly circles, real love, the kind that makes your stomach flutter and your cheeks flush, was almost always reserved for affairs. Secret crushes, doomed passions, the kind of thing that if acted upon, destroyed families or got you sent to a convent. But that didn't stop people from dreaming. In fact, whole genres of literature sprang up around this precise dilemma, loving someone you couldn't have. Think courtly love, the literary invention of 12th century troubadours and poets. A knight falls for a noble lady, usually married. He suffers, pines, writes her poems, maybe dies in battle thinking of her name. She rarely returns his affection, and if she does, they both suffer horribly. Historians still argue whether courtly love was ever real, or just a poetic exercise, an emotional sandbox for repressed feelings. But one thing's certain: it was not the kind of love you built a legal marriage around. You pass the chapel and hear a boy reciting lines to himself. My heart, like a falcon, flies to thee, though bound by tethered duty. He stops when he sees you, flushes, looks away. It's cute and completely unwise, because in this society, to speak openly of romantic affection is to risk everything: your reputation, your alliances, your family's good name. Love is considered frivolous at best and immoral at worst. It distracts from duty, it interferes with strategy. Even the church warned against love-based decisions. Passions were suspect, emotions were seen as weaknesses, vulnerabilities to be exploited. Better to remain neutral, sensible, well-matched by class and creed. A fringe example? In medieval Persia, the tale of Layla and Majnun became legendary. Two lovers driven mad by their forbidden desire, forever separated, forever longing. Their story became symbolic of pure but unattainable love, a love so real it could never survive in society. And that was the point. Love couldn't be real unless it was impossible. You pass a group of older women, sitting near the well discussing a scandal from 2 towns over. A young woman fell for a travelling lute player, of all people, and tried to run away with him. Her father caught them before they reached the woods. The lute player banished the girl, married off within a week to a wealthy widower who needed help raising his 6 children. That'll teach her to listen to music. The message is clear: don't fall in love with someone outside your station, your religion, your assigned social orbit. It's embarrassing, it's destabilizing, it's, how do they say it, unbecoming. So what do people do? They write, they dream, they sneak glances in the market. They read those secret love stories: Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, Abelard and Eloise. They memorize verses by candlelight. They press dried petals into books, and they marry someone else, because real life isn't a sonnet, it's a schedule. And the irony is thick. The more society warns against passionate love, the more people become obsessed with it. It becomes a fantasy, a secret rebellion, a forbidden fruit hanging just out of reach. You return home to find your younger cousin sketching a heart into the dirt with a stick. You nudge it away before your aunt sees. She's been watching her like a hawk ever since the miller's apprentice started hanging around. There's no time for love here, no room for it. But people still find little cracks in the walls. They steal minutes in the hayloft. They exchange glances over bread loaves. They whisper names in the dark, even if they'll never say them aloud again. And maybe that's the real tragedy, not that people didn't love, but that they had to hide it. You settle into your chair by the window and watch the shadows lengthen. Somewhere a poet is rhyming love with dove. Somewhere a girl is packing her satchel with bread and ribbon, hoping no one catches her at the gate. Somewhere someone is standing at an altar with a person they barely know, all the while aching for the one they're not allowed to name. In this world, real love is subversive. It's not the beginning of the story. It's the secret you carry with you until the end. You stir awake beneath a heavy quilt and an even heavier truth. In this world, falling in love isn't romantic, it's rebellious, because today you learn what happens when someone dares to follow their heart in a society built on contract, land deeds, and bloodlines. And, spoiler, it usually doesn't end in a honeymoon. You slip outside into the early grey morning, where a trail of fresh footprints in the frost leads away from the village. 2 sets, one light, one heavy, one hopeful, one terrified. Someone ran away in the night, and everyone already knows. In tightly controlled societies, marrying for love wasn't just discouraged, it was a breach of order, a risk to the social structure, a challenge to your parents, your priest, your elders, your village, and possibly the law itself. Because when you fall in love, you're not just disobeying your family, You're disrupting an entire system. You remember a local girl, Lena, who dared to fall for a stable hand. No name, no coin, no crest. But he was funny and kind, and she claimed he smelled like pine and freedom. They met in secret for months. Then one day, they disappeared. 3 days later, Lena was dragged back, mud-streaked and sobbing. Her lover, never seen again. Rumors said he was dealt with. No one asked too many questions. Because love that bypasses permission is dangerous. You see, arranged marriages, dowries and alliances weren't just traditions. They were mechanisms of control. They tied families together, kept wealth consolidated, and prevented chaos. Letting individuals marry for love threatened all of that. In many medieval and early modern societies, eloping wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. A runaway couple could be excommunicated, fined, imprisoned, or worse. In France, for instance, a noblewoman marrying without her family's approval could lose her inheritance and face social ruin. A mainstream historical fact. In the early 1600s, English law required a marriage to be publicly announced in church, the banns, 3 weeks in a row before it could take place. The goal? Give anyone time to object, especially parents. Private, secret unions were considered clandestine marriages and could be nullified if challenged. You sit at the village well, watching neighbours whisper and glance toward Lena's family cottage. The shutters are closed. Her father hasn't been seen since yesterday. Her mother is out front, scrubbing the same patch of earth over and over. You know what that means. Shame has settled in. The cost of Lena's rebellion isn't just her own suffering. It's collective. Her parents are humiliated, their reputation tarnished. Any younger siblings? Good luck getting them married now. No respectable family wants to link itself with a house of scandal, and this is how society keeps people in line, by making rebellion expensive. But still, some dared. A fringe tidbit. In 17th century Scotland, couples could be married instantly, just by declaring themselves husband and wife in front of witnesses, leading to the rise of runaway weddings in border towns like Gretna Green. English couples would flee there to escape parental veto. It became so popular that the local blacksmiths ended up performing thousands of these anvil weddings. Yes, wedded at the forge. Historians still argue whether Gretna Green marriages were truly subversive acts of passion, or just convenient escapes from restrictive laws. Back in your world, you tuck your shawl around your shoulders and remember how your mother once whispered, "Don't ever love someone who can't pay the tax." It sounded cruel then. It sounds crueler now, but you understand what she meant. Love, when it isn't backed by coin or status, is a tax in itself, and the bill comes due, fast. Still, some people refused to care. They carved names into trees. They left letters in cracks between stones. They met under moonlight with no future beyond the next whispered promise. And you can't help but admire them. They risked it all for something everyone else considered foolish. Because in a world obsessed with control, love becomes an act of defiance. You head home as bells toll again. Another wedding today. This one approved, celebrated, funded. The bride is barely 16. The groom is twice her age with 4 sons and a respectable beard. They'll be fine. Probably, maybe even happy, in a quiet, practical way. But you know she didn't choose him. And you know she's thinking of someone else, someone who gave her a carved comb or a song, or a flower she had to hide in her apron until it wilted. And that's the thing about rebellion. Sometimes it burns bright and fast. Sometimes it flickers in silence just behind the eyes. You look up at the sky and wonder if Lena will ever be allowed outside again. You wonder if she regrets it. You wonder if she'd do it again anyway. And then you wonder, if someone held out their hand to you, would you take it? Even if it meant losing everything? You don't want to get out of bed this morning, because today you learn the most unspeakable rule of all. You can fall in love, but not with the wrong person. And wrong isn't about character, it's about class. In this world, love is not only dangerous, it's hierarchical. To love downward or upward or sideways across social boundaries is to invite ruin. You might as well fall in love with a ghost. At least then no one would care about his income. You sit by the window, brushing your hair, and catch sight of him again, the candlemaker's apprentice. Hands always flecked with wax. Kind eyes. He brings extra candles to the older widows on market days. Once you tripped over your skirt and dropped a basket of pears and he helped you pick them up. Didn't say much, just smiled and nodded. And now you can't stop thinking about him. But you're a merchant's daughter and he's not. So no, you can't love him. In rigidly stratified societies, class boundaries were not fences you could climb over. They were moats filled with suspicion and shame. Marriage between social ranks wasn't forbidden by law in most places. It was worse, forbidden by custom. The higher your station, the narrower your options. If you were nobility, you had to marry nobility. If you were a tradesman's daughter, maybe you could marry a blacksmith or a butcher. But a noble? Not unless it was scandal. And scandals are terrible at dinner parties. A mainstream historical fact. In 18th century France, the aristocracy lived under strict rules of endogamy, marriage within their own class. Marrying below your station could lead to social exile, loss of inheritance, or even a cold disinvitation to Versailles, the horror. Royal families were even stricter. Bloodlines were practically sacred. Kings might take lovers from any class, but marriage, that had to be pure pedigree. You leave the house and walk toward the apothecary, clutching a list of herbs your mother sent you for. But really, you're hoping to pass by the candlemaker's shop. Just a glimpse. You're being foolish. You know this, because even if he loved you back, which he probably doesn't, it would lead nowhere. His family has no land, no crest, no gold-threaded tablecloths, and your family? They're already deep in talks about a match with the son of a cooper, the kind of union that keeps trade routes secure and aunties quiet. Loving the candlemaker wouldn't just be impractical, it would be a threat to the delicate balance your parents have spent decades maintaining. That's what people forget. Class isn't just about money, it's about continuity. Families marry up or across to preserve or improve their standing. To reach down is to invite instability. It means explaining yourself at every gathering for the next 20 years. Fringe example? In Qing Dynasty China, intermarriage between the ruling Manchu elite and Han Chinese commoners was heavily discouraged, even forbidden in official positions. Families who attempted such unions risked political backlash, and some were quietly stripped of privileges. Historians still argue whether these laws were truly enforced or just symbolic barriers, but the message was clear: stay in your lane. You duck into the alley behind the tannery when you see your cousin approaching. She's the worst kind of cousin, observant. You don't want her to see your expression when you glance toward the candlemaker's shop. You've been told before to stop staring at your feet like a milkmaid, but you're not looking at your feet, you're looking at him. And there's nothing you can do about it, because even if you gathered your courage, walked up to him and confessed your feelings, what then? He can't offer your family anything they need. No influence, no trade ties, no parcels of land near the river. He can offer you his hands, his smile, his time, and that's not enough. You pass a group of young boys wrestling in the mud. One of them is the butcher's son. He once asked your sister if she'd teach him to read. Everyone laughed. She laughed too. Then cried later, behind the bread oven. That's how class works. It hides behind politeness, but cuts just as deep. And even when there are love matches across class lines, they're rarely happy stories. The lower status partner spends a lifetime trying to measure up. The higher status one lives under constant suspicion. Was it love? Or were they just after a softer pillow? Even fairy tales get it wrong. Cinderella may win the prince, but she only does so after a magical makeover. Nobody's marrying her when she's still covered in soot. You reach home, empty-handed, you forgot the herbs. Your mother sighs and sends your cousin instead. You sit in your room and write his name in the dust on your windowsill, then wipe it away. You know how this ends. It doesn't. He'll marry someone practical, a girl who knows how to twist wicks and pack orders. You'll marry someone solid, a man who smells like sawdust and ambition. You'll both live respectable lives. And in 20 years, if your eyes ever meet across the crowd at the market, maybe you'll exchange a quiet nod. Nothing more. Because love, when it's aimed outside your class, isn't just inconvenient, it's unthinkable. You wake with a strange feeling in your chest, like something's been rearranged in the night. The fire's out, the bread's gone. Your little brother is chasing the dog in circles, oblivious to the fact that today you'll be told something both deeply unsettling and very, very common. You're marrying your cousin. Not because he's the only option, not because you like him, but because keeping it in the family is safer, simpler, and, if you're from the right class, expected. You walk through the kitchen in silence while your mother casually mentions that your uncle's son will be joining you for supper tonight. To reacquaint. As if this is a friendly gathering. As if this isn't a prelude to a lifetime. Because today you learn about intrafamily marriage, a centuries-old strategy to preserve bloodlines, consolidate wealth, and in some rather unfortunate cases, ruin your family tree from the inside out. You try not to make a face. In noble circles especially, the logic is clear. If you want to keep land, power, and money tightly controlled, you marry someone whose inheritance is already half yours. Problem solved. Titles stay in the family, property doesn't get chopped up between in-laws, and your name stays pure. Well, purity comes at a price. A mainstream historical fact. The Habsburgs, Europe's most famously inbred royal family, married cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, even double first cousins, all in the name of dynastic unity. By the 17th century, the family's most notable heir, Charles II of Spain, had such severe physical and mental disabilities that he could barely speak, chew food, or govern. Historians still argue whether his condition was purely genetic or made worse by generations of pedigree obsession. You help set the table as your cousin arrives, awkward, lanky, smelling faintly of sheep. You haven't seen him in years. He looks like someone who once stole your marbles and you're supposed to spend your life with him. But it's not about affection, it's about control. Because marrying outside your family creates risk, foreign influence, divided loyalties, inheritance confusion. Marrying inside your family? That's clean, efficient, strategic, and, disturbingly, often celebrated. In ancient Egypt, royal siblings married routinely, pharaoh to pharaoh's sister. Not because it was romantic, but because they believed divine blood couldn't mix with anything mortal. So they just kept it close, very close. Even in medieval Europe, marriage among cousins, especially first cousins, was common. The church occasionally protested, but dispensations were easy to acquire if you had enough coin or connections. Marry your cousin, and everyone knew where the wheat and the titles would go. You try to make small talk over stew. Your cousin says he's recently learned how to shoe horses. He's proud of it. You nod. He's not awful. Exactly. Just familiar, too familiar. You remember when he used to eat bees on a dare, and yet this might be your fate, because even among commoners, cousin marriage had its place. In small villages with limited populations, choices were scarce. Marrying someone with the same last name wasn't scandal, it was survival. At least you knew what their parents were like. A fringe tidbit. In 19th century rural America, cousin marriage wasn't all that unusual. Abraham Lincoln's parents were distant cousins. In fact, laws banning cousin marriage in the US didn't appear until the mid to late 1800s, often tied to eugenic fears rather than moral outrage. And here's where it gets messier. For many cultures, cousin marriage wasn't just tolerated, it was preferred. In parts of the Middle East and South Asia, marrying your father's brother's daughter is still considered ideal. It keeps family wealth intact and ensures that brides won't be mistreated by strangers. After all, if your husband is also your cousin, his mother is your aunt, and she's less likely to harm her niece than a random daughter-in-law, in theory. Historians still debate whether these customs arose from patriarchy, pragmatism, or both. You walk your cousin to the gate after dinner. He's polite, says he's glad to see you, offers to help with the roof thatch next week. He even picks a flower and hands it to you, though it's half squashed. It's almost sweet. But you're still not convinced. Because deep down you long for difference, for strangeness, for a partner who didn't eat bees. But your family doesn't want different. They want predictable. And what could be more predictable than someone who already shares your grandmother? You lie in bed later that night, staring at the beams overhead, thinking about all the women before you who married familiar faces because it was expected, because it was easier, because no one wanted to risk a field or a name or a sheep, and you wonder how many of them looked across the dinner table and saw a cousin and thought, well, I guess it could be worse. And how many thought, yes, this is safety, because that's what it comes down to. In this world, love is uncertain, but blood is reliable, even if it loops back on itself. You wake to the quiet thud of a door closing gently down the hall. It's still dark, no footsteps, no voices, just the slow creak of the rafters settling into the hush of early morning. You roll over and feel the chill of the sheets beside you, empty, and it hits you, this is not a love story. Because today you learn what happens when marriages go cold, when affection doesn't bloom, when that good match becomes just a roommate, a stranger, a lifelong silence. Welcome to the world of love behind closed doors. You sit by the window watching frost creep along the corners of the glass. Outside, your neighbour's husband loads a cart. He doesn't speak to her. She doesn't look at him. They haven't shared a bed in over a year, everyone says. They sleep on opposite sides of the house now. And yet, there's no scandal, no sympathy, no change. Because this is normal. A loveless marriage isn't a tragedy here. It's a statistical likelihood. And since divorce isn't an option, not legally, not socially, not financially, you just endure. Quietly, elegantly, maybe bitterly, maybe with resigned acceptance. You marry young, you hope for the best, but if the best doesn't come, you adapt, or you find affection elsewhere. A mainstream historical fact. In 18th century aristocratic France, many noble couples slept in separate bedrooms by design. The marriage was often about heirs, not intimacy. Once the children were produced, emotional distance wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Affairs were common, discretion was the only real rule. You finish peeling turnips while your aunt retells a local tale. The baker's wife who loved the cooper. They met on Sunday mornings under the guise of gathering herbs. The town knew. No one said a word. Her husband was away often. His wife didn't ask questions. It was a quiet agreement wrapped in loud silence. Because when marriages are arranged for power, property, or prestige, not passion, emotional fulfillment becomes a side project. You might get lucky, you might not, and if not, you learn to find warmth where you can. A look, a letter, a garden you can tend without being told you're doing it wrong. A fringe tidbit. In early 20th century England, women of the upper class often took lovers in middle age once their husbands became emotionally or physically distant. These were sometimes called companion arrangements. A gentleman friend, a dancing partner, a man who noticed new hairpins. Historians still argue whether these quiet romances were tolerated due to gendered double standards or simply because everyone preferred polite illusions over open conflict. You sweep the hearth and hear your mother remind you again. A good husband doesn't have to love you, he just has to stay. She means well, she always has. But you wonder if she believes it, or if that's just something she repeats to make her own life feel softer. You think about your father, how he clears his throat before entering a room your mother's already in. How he thanks her for supper but never compliments her dress. How they haven't touched hands since you were small. There's no violence, no cruelty, just absence. And absence in these marriages becomes the wallpaper, the backdrop, the air you learn to breathe. You notice your cousin sewing by the fire. She's working on something fine, a handkerchief with lace edging. It's not for her husband, it's too delicate, too pretty. You ask who it's for, and she says nothing, just tucks it away when footsteps approach. You both understand you don't speak of it again, because the most forbidden feelings aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet longings, the maybes, the imagined other lives that flicker before you when the room is dark and the fire has died down. You wonder how many women walked this same path, how many men, how many hearts found ways to beat around the marriage rather than inside it. And not all of it was scandalous. Sometimes it was just friendship, a trusted servant, a fellow reader, a childless widow who always had extra tea, because people find love where they can. And when the door to romantic marriage is closed, they climb through windows. You lie in bed again and stare at the ceiling. Your husband turns over, murmurs something unintelligible, and falls back asleep. He hasn't spoken a kind word in days, but he fixed the roof last week, bought apples from the market, told your brother a joke about chickens that made everyone laugh. It's not love, but it's not nothing. You wonder if that's enough. And you fall asleep with your back to him, heart full of questions wrapped in silence that stretches far beyond the walls of your home. Because behind so many closed doors in history, there was not hatred, not passion, but simply nothing at all. You wake up with the scent of morning bread in the air, and something else. Freedom, maybe. Or at least the distant echo of it. Because today you learn that not every woman accepted her fate with folded hands and a sigh. Some found ways to slip through the cracks. Welcome to the secret, ingenious world of women's tiny escape hatches, the loopholes, delays, refusals, and clever detours that allowed a handful of history's daughters to avoid or postpone unwanted marriages. You pull on your cloak and follow your aunt to market. She's buying herbs. You're there to learn how to manage a household, or so she says. But what she's really teaching you, without quite saying it, is how to buy time, how to buy space, how to say not yet when no isn't allowed. Because some women in certain times and places figured out that if you can't say no, you can at least say wait. A mainstream historical fact. In Renaissance Italy, girls were often sent to convents, not necessarily to take holy vows, but to delay marriage. It was a respectable holding pattern, a way to avoid political entanglements until better matches appeared or dowries could be gathered. Some stayed for life. Others emerged in their 20s, surprisingly still single and quietly more independent than anyone expected. You pass by the old abbey and wonder how many of those women behind the stone walls chose that life, chose to trade marriage for quiet gardens and prayer. Maybe some were forced, but maybe some preferred it, because while the world told them to be brides, they chose to be something else. Another trick, feigning illness. In 18th century England, it was not uncommon for girls to claim nerves, melancholy, or fainting spells to avoid weddings. She's too frail, the family would whisper, marriage might kill her. It rarely worked forever, but it could buy a few months, a season, enough time for something to change or someone to disappear. A fringe tidbit, in certain rural parts of Scandinavia, women could request a bedding delay, a formal request to postpone consummation of marriage for health or spiritual reasons. Local law supported this, and if the groom refused, he might be fined. Historians still argue how often this was used sincerely and how often it was simply a legal pause button. You stop at a spice stall and listen to two older women gossip. They're talking about a merchant's daughter who accidentally let her betrothal contract expire before the wedding was finalized. Apparently, no one noticed the ink was never stamped. The merchant's wife? She definitely noticed, but said nothing. She remembered being young, too. Not every escape was dramatic. Sometimes it was just sabotage, losing a veil on the wedding day, burning bread at the engagement dinner, saying something just impolite enough to scare off a suitor. You wouldn't dare say you didn't want to marry him, but you might accidentally insult his boots in front of his mother. You return home and glance at your sister, seated by the hearth with a book she's pretending not to read. It's poetry, romantic poetry. You both know she's supposed to be sewing her wedding shift, but she's been busy for weeks now, keeps forgetting to start, and no one pushes her. Because deep down, maybe they understand. Because even the most rigid parents sometimes soften in silence. Even the strictest families remember being young. Not all escape hatches were gentle. Some women ran. They dressed as boys. They disappeared into cities. They climbed out windows in the dark. They paid midwives or washerwomen to carry letters to secret lovers, asking for rescue. Most failed. But some vanished so thoroughly they became legends. Whispers passed between daughters over spinning wheels. You light a candle at dusk and reread the letter you haven't sent yet. To someone you shouldn't write to. He lives 3 villages away. He has no title, but he knows how to listen. And he said once, carefully, that he'd wait. That was months ago. You haven't decided yet. You may never decide, but knowing you could, knowing there's a door, even if it's hidden, that changes everything, because sometimes the tiniest crack in a wall is enough to let in light. And sometimes that's all a girl needs to keep breathing. You blow out the candle and climb into bed, heart quiet, eyes steady. You haven't escaped, but you haven't surrendered either, not yet. You wake to the thump of boots outside and the sharp clang of metal. Someone's sharpening tools again, probably for the harvest, but for you, today holds no scythe, no sickle, no sheaves of wheat. Today you learn the other side of the story, what it was like to be the groom. Because contrary to the storybook version, not all men in history got to chase love through meadows, sweep girls off their feet, and marry for passion. In fact, many didn't get to choose at all. You pull on your boots and step outside, and there he is, your cousin's fiancé, standing stiff in his good shirt, getting instructions from his father as if he's about to purchase a cow. There's no smile, no eagerness, just the look of a man who's been handed a duty and is determined not to flinch. Because for most of history, marriage was an obligation for men too, not to romance, to property, to lineage, to strategy. A mainstream historical fact. In ancient Rome, elite men were expected to marry to secure political alliances and continue their family name. Personal feelings? Largely irrelevant. Augustus Caesar even implemented marriage laws that penalized unmarried men over a certain age. You could literally be fined for staying single too long. Imagine trying to explain to your grandfather that you're still waiting to find the right person. He'd probably hand you a ledger and say, then pick the person with the cleanest debt. You cross the courtyard and watch as your cousin's betrothal proceeds. He's being offered ale and bread, not because it's a celebration, but because it's done. The girl is young, nervous, blinking a lot. They've exchanged 6 sentences total. The marriage is scheduled for Michaelmas, he tells you quietly later, while tightening his boots. She's fine. I suppose she'll do. You suppose she'll do? That's the most romance you'll hear from him all season. But it's not that he's unkind or indifferent. He's just trapped in a mirror version of your own story. He's the inheritor, the stabilizer, the one expected to secure his father's legacy and carry on the farm, or the forge, or the family name. He's not thinking about poetry. He's thinking about tax rolls. A fringe tidbit? In 16th century China, the pressure on sons to marry and produce heirs was so intense that some families arranged marriages posthumously, betrothing deceased sons to living women or other deceased daughters to fulfill ritual and ancestral obligations. The wedding would go ahead without one of the participants. A ghost marriage, romantic? No, but very well attended. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were spiritual stopgaps or a cultural reflection of how deeply marriage was embedded in social duty, even beyond death. You help your cousin fix a broken hinge and ask, carefully, if he wanted someone else. He shrugs. There was a girl once, he says. She smiled at me too long. That's all he says. Because men who marry for love, just for love, are often seen as reckless, unmanly, foolish. They're supposed to think of land, alliances, economic balance. The personal is unimportant. The family must be advanced. The name must continue. And so they do as they're told. Even kings, you've heard the stories. Royal men forced to marry foreign princesses they've never met, then keep mistresses on the side to maintain emotional survival. You've heard the jokes about noble husbands spending more time with their falcons than their wives. It's funny until it's not. Until you realize most men didn't marry their sweethearts either. They married their assignments. You watch your cousin walk toward his future, jaws set. He will be a good husband. He will do what's expected, but it's hard not to notice that something in his eyes has quietly folded itself up and put itself away. He's not heartbroken. He's just closed. And you wonder how many men, across how many centuries, woke up on their wedding day thinking not of joy or nerves or excitement, but of ledgers, fences, and the sound of their father's voice saying, "Do not embarrass us." Maybe that's why the poets always wrote of women, the stolen glances, the weeping, the longing. But the men, the grooms, they disappear because duty doesn't make for good drama. And yet behind every marriage signed with a wax seal and a handshake was a man expected to hold it all together. Quietly, obediently, and without question. You head home as the sky fades to violet. Somewhere in the hills a boy is sitting beside a stream, humming a song no one will ever hear. Somewhere in a ledger, his name is already penciled in beside someone else's daughter. And somewhere deep inside him, he's already learned the truth. Love is a luxury. Marriage is a job. You wake to the sound of crinkled paper. Someone's left a folded pamphlet on the table, its edges smudged with soot and fingerprints. You unfold it, blinking away sleep. The title reads, "The Sorrows of Young Werther," and just like that, today you learn how fiction began changing everything. Because for centuries, marriage was a duty, a strategy, a sentence. But then someone started writing stories, stories with feelings, with longings, with endings that weren't arranged by priests or fathers, but by hearts that couldn't bear to be apart. And people, especially women, started to believe. You toss on a shawl and step outside, still holding the pamphlet. The wind tugs at its pages, but you clutch it tightly, because what's inside feels like rebellion wrapped in ink. A mainstream historical fact? Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, published in 1774, was a sensation across Europe. It told the story of a man destroyed by unrequited love, and readers, particularly women, were shattered. Some reportedly fainted. Others copied Werther's fashion. A few even died by suicide in imitation. The novel was blamed for a spike in emotional excess. Historians still argue whether the so-called Werther effect was real. But one thing was certain. For the first time, love wasn't being treated as a weakness or distraction. It was being portrayed as something central, unstoppable, tragic, and beautiful. You sit by the well, pamphlet folded in your lap, and think, what if marriage could be like that? Not cold, not practical, but consuming. It's a dangerous thought, and it's spreading. Romantic literature bloomed in the 18th and 19th centuries like dandelions in spring. Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, Rousseau, Choderlos de Laclos, all writing of love that defied parents, class and custom. They didn't just tell stories, they planted ideas, and ideas, as it turns out, are hard to unplant. Suddenly, girls who once nodded dutifully at their betrothal began to ask questions. Will he be kind? Will he understand me? Will he read books? Questions no one asked before, questions no one wanted asked. You return home to find your younger sister crying, not over chores or spilled milk, but over a fictional letter between two doomed lovers. She reads it aloud through sniffles. "I cannot breathe without you." It's melodramatic. You roll your eyes. But then you feel your throat tighten too, because even you want that kind of love now. Fiction didn't just change how people felt, it changed how they expected to feel. And suddenly marrying someone because he owned 3 pigs and had a stable roof felt insufficient. A fringe tidbit? In early 19th century Russia, readers were so enamored with romantic novels that young women began writing their own tales, circulating handwritten love manuscripts through tight-knit social circles. These often ended in dramatic death scenes or heroic elopements, not because that was common, but because common wasn't good enough anymore. You pause by the hearth and look at your father's bookshelf, mostly law books, some sermon collections. Then tucked behind a dusty candlestick, you spot it. Clarissa by Samuel Richardson, dog-eared, pages warped, your mother's name faintly scribbled on the flyleaf. You smile, because somewhere, at some point, even she dreamed of love. Even she read about letters under moonlight, or heroes who'd cross oceans for a kiss. But here's the twist. While fiction fed dreams, society didn't catch up. Girls started to hope, boys started to yearn. But the rules, still in place, the contracts, still binding. You could fall in love reading by the fire, but you'd still marry someone selected at the kitchen table between bites of boiled carrot and sighs of compromise. And maybe that's why the novels became so precious. Not because they reflected life, but because they offered something outside it. You pull your shawl tighter and step back inside. Your sister is rereading the final chapter. She clutches the page as if it's a lifeline. And maybe it is, because romantic fiction didn't just entertain, it woke something up. It whispered, what if your heart mattered? And once whispered, that question can never be unheard. So you keep the pamphlet tucked inside your bodice, close to your skin, a secret, a shield, because you're still bound by duty, still expected to obey. But now, you know there's something else out there. You may not reach it, but the knowing, that's the beginning of everything. You wake to the clip-clop of hooves outside the window and the distant chatter of servants preparing a courtyard. Someone's arriving, a suitor maybe, or just a neighbour with gossip. Either way, the house is being dusted with a kind of ceremonial nervousness, and you know what that means, because today you learn how courting became a thing. Not marriage, not romance, not yet, but something in between, something awkward, measured, socially approved. You throw on your apron and head downstairs, passing your aunt polishing candlesticks and your mother rearranging her hair 3 times in the reflection of a spoon. The suitor will be here by midday, which means you'll be courted. But before your heart jumps, you should know it's not the dreamy, slow-motion montage version. Courtship in history was not a swirl of violins and stolen kisses under the stars. It was ritual, a choreography of glances, notes, visits, and parental observation. And above all, it was supervised, a mainstream historical fact. In the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in Western Europe and colonial America, courtship became increasingly formalized. A young man didn't just stroll into your home and sweep you off your feet. He had to be invited, vetted. He sat in the parlor under your father's gaze while you poured tea and made conversation about root vegetables. Every word was watched, every gesture evaluated. Your mother once said, "A true lady knows how to express interest without ever looking interested," which is exhausting but necessary. Because even though marriages were still often arranged or heavily guided, courtship gave the illusion of choice. You sit by the window with your embroidery as your guest arrives. He's polite, smells of horse leather and expensive soap, and makes a joke about the weather that your father laughs at too enthusiastically. Your job? Smile, laugh gently, nod, but not too much. Too much enthusiasm signals desperation, too little signals pride. You walk the garden path with him under the watchful eye of your chaperone. He asks about your favorite color. You tell him it's green. He says his mother likes green. It's a start. And while it might seem artificial, it's still more freedom than your grandmother had. Back then, introductions happened at the altar. Now at least you get 3 supervised conversations and a church picnic before sealing your fate. A fringe tidbit. In colonial America, a custom called bundling allowed courting couples to spend the night together, fully clothed in bed, often with a board between them. It sounds absurd now, but at the time it was seen as a practical way to encourage intimacy without intimacy before engagement. Historians still argue whether bundling reduced premarital pregnancy or simply increased creativity. You return to the house and your aunt quizzes you immediately. Did he compliment your posture? Did he mention his mother's health? Did he touch your elbow? Each of these questions has layers, implications, unwritten rules. Because courtship was a performance, and you were being reviewed like a stage play. Your suitor leaves with a bow and a promise to return. You don't know how you feel, you're still processing. You think maybe he's fine, but you also think maybe your heart deserves more than fine, and that's dangerous, because the moment you start feeling, the whole structure gets shaky, and courtship was designed to control that, to allow affection, but never too much, to encourage compatibility, but not rebellion. You climb the stairs to your room, where a friend's letter waits on the sill. She writes about her courtship, how the man she favors always arrives with dusty boots and speaks too softly for her father to approve. But he brings her books and listens when she speaks. She writes, "I think I could live beside him forever." Is that enough? You don't know, because courtship offers no guarantees. It promises the possibility of affection, but it still bends to structure, to social calendars, to the eyes of the elders peering over teacups. You lie in bed that night, thinking of the boy with the polite questions and the clean coat. You wonder if he'll write, if you'll respond, if this will be the start of something warm or just another slow step toward a decision you didn't really make. Because even now, with all these new rituals, you're still not fully choosing. You're simply navigating, smiling at the right time, speaking just enough, laughing like you mean it, and maybe, just maybe, hoping something real finds its way through all the ceremony. You wake to the sound of footsteps running across gravel, fast, urgent, not sneaky enough to be quiet, but not bold enough to knock on a door. Someone has run away again, and today you learn what happens when two people can't stand to wait for permission, when love grows too wild for drawing rooms, too impatient for courtship, too brave for consequences. Today, you learn about the scandal of elopement. You sit by the kitchen table, sipping weak tea, while the household whispers begin. Did you hear? They left in the night. No bands, no priest, just gone. You know exactly who they're talking about. Elopement is not a romantic comedy here. It's social heresy. It's the couple who skipped past every rule, every watchful eye, every tradition that was supposed to keep things orderly, and for that, there will be consequences, a mainstream historical fact. In early modern England, the church required the reading of the banns, a public announcement of a couple's intent to marry read aloud in church for 3 consecutive Sundays. This gave families, neighbours and busybodies a chance to object, but if a couple married secretly without banns or licence, the union could be declared invalid or, worse, scandalous. And eloping wasn't just about love, it was often about defiance. You pull on your shoes and head toward the green, where everyone's gathered. The village priest looks tired. He's already fielding questions from 3 mothers, each demanding to know why their daughters haven't done something foolish. The blacksmith's son, tall, clever, poor, has run off with the miller's niece. She was supposed to marry someone else next month, someone who owned half a wheat field and spoke Latin. The marriage was set until it wasn't, and now the field will stay unmerged, the families will feud, and a pair of newlyweds is out there, clinging to hope, galloping toward whatever chapel or border or tolerant village they think will accept them. You feel a strange thrill in your chest, not because you envy them, but because you understand, because elopement is more than impulse, it's an act of desperation. The last door available when every other one is locked tight. A fringe tidbit? In 19th century America, elopements often ended in Gretna Greens of their own. Small towns, sympathetic judges, even travelling ministers who specialised in fast, quiet unions. A popular one? Elkton, Maryland, where couples from across the East Coast could be wed in under 10 minutes. No banns, no family approval, just one breathless "I do." Historians still debate how many of these matches survived. Many were impulsive, some were disastrous, but some endured. You wander past the edge of the village and wonder what happens next, not just for the eloped lovers, but for those left behind. The bride's family will grieve, loudly, publicly. They'll claim she was bewitched, or coerced, or simply naive. Her mother will weep at market, but not for her daughter, for her name, her dignity, the plans that now unravel like bad wool. The groom's family? That depends. If he's poor, they'll call him reckless. If he's wealthy, they'll quietly rewrite the story to make it sound noble. That's the thing about elopement. It can never be just romantic. It's always a statement. You return home and see your mother holding a letter. It's not for you. It's addressed in a delicate hand, tied with red string. From someone's daughter now far away. She reads it once, twice, says nothing, then burns it. Because forgiveness might come later, but for now, scandal must be handled with flame. You stare out the window, wondering if you'll ever be brave enough to choose love over approval, to leap even if the ground beneath isn't solid, to run even if no one's waiting on the other side. Because elopement isn't just about romance, it's about deciding your life is yours, no matter the cost. And in this world, that's the most dangerous and daring choice of all. You wake to the crackling sound of firewood and the faint chirp of birds unfamiliar to your ears. The air smells different, brighter, dustier, freer somehow. Because today you are not in the village anymore, not in the manor house, not in the fields of Europe where rules grow like hedgerows. Today you've crossed an ocean. Today you learn how colonial love experiments began to challenge the old world's ideas. You stretch beneath a rough blanket in a cabin barely the size of your old pantry. The floorboards creak, the roof leaks, and the neighbours are close. But the customs? Looser, lighter, undefined? Because out here, in the strange, sprawling chaos of colonial settlements, the rigid laws of love and marriage began to bend. Not always, not everywhere, but more than you'd expect. A mainstream historical fact: in the 17th century New England, Puritan communities held marriage in high regard but did not consider it a religious sacrament. Unlike in Europe, weddings here were often conducted by civil authorities, not priests. The result? A system where courtship, choice, and even divorce were more accessible, especially for women. You step outside into the morning dust and see a couple passing by. She wears her husband's oversized coat, and he's holding their baby, humming something gentle. They're not aristocrats, not matched by dowries or bloodlines, just settlers who met, spoke, decided, and married. Here, people marry for practical reasons, yes, but sometimes they marry for affection too. Because on the frontier, survival depends less on pedigree and more on compatibility. It doesn't matter who your father was. It matters if you can chop wood, tend goats, and stay calm when the wheat fails. You hear it in the way couples speak. He's good to me. She's strong. We make it work. That's not poetry, but it's partnership, a fringe tidbit. In early colonial Maryland, a shortage of women led to unique dynamics. Some women received land incentives or gifts of livestock to marry newly arrived settlers. These weren't forced marriages, just encouraged opportunities. And in several cases, women actually negotiated their own terms before agreeing. Imagine that, negotiating your own marriage agreement in the 1600s. Historians still argue whether these arrangements empowered women or simply reshaped the same old dynamics in new territory. But either way, they were different. You pass the town meeting house and hear a neighbour arguing, not about land or oxen, but about love. A young man wants to marry someone from a rival family. There's concern, of course. But no one says impossible. No one threatens exile. They just sigh, debate, and eventually nod. Because here, people are rebuilding rules. They've left behind their pews, their lords, their bands and bindings, and while some customs linger, many have gone soft at the edges. You stop by the well and speak to a woman who once lived in London. She tells you, with a gleam in her eye, that out here she chose her own husband. No approvals sought, no papers filed. Just a promise by firelight, and 2 witnesses who kept quiet. Was it legal? She shrugs, and enough. That's the thing. In places where laws haven't settled in, love sneaks in first. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but at least it belongs to the couple, not to the contract. Of course, not all colonial experiments were liberating. In many cases, marriage still preserved hierarchy, especially between settler and enslaved, colonizer and indigenous. These were not love stories, these were power stories, and they still echo painfully through the walls of history. But among settlers of equal standing, especially in smaller, less watched communities, marriage became more fluid, a space where affection could matter, sometimes even lead. You return to your cabin and light a candle. Your neighbor's daughter is being courted by a farmhand. She says he makes her laugh. That's enough. They'll marry next spring if the chickens lay well and the roof stays dry. There's no question of bloodlines, no bands, no bundles of coins, just two people choosing. And you realize across the sea, in the old world, your marriage would have been decided by now. The contracts drawn, the linens folded, the veil prepared. But here, you're not betrothed, not yet. And it's not because you're waiting for permission, it's because you're still deciding. You wake with a ledger on your lap. You didn't fall asleep with it, but there it is, a thick, crinkled notebook full of tidy columns. Goats owned, fields measured, barrels of salted fish exchanged, and somewhere near the back, marriage offers. Because today you learn about something no one likes to say out loud. Love didn't stand a chance once money got involved. Welcome to the world of emotional economics, where your feelings are important, sure, but only if they align with the numbers. You stretch your legs and blink toward the morning light, half dreading the knock on the door. Your father's meeting with a merchant today, not because he likes him, but because the merchant's son has been looking for a wife, and their two ledgers seem to agree on everything. Love, that's a luxury. The budget comes first. A mainstream historical fact? By the 18th century, with capitalism taking root and trade exploding across Europe and the colonies, marriage became even more economic. In places like England, France, and the Netherlands, marriage contracts resembled business deals, listing dowries, debts, property rights, and obligations. Some were notarized with more detail than a ship insurance policy. And just like that, your heart becomes an asset, something to manage, preserve, or sacrifice depending on the quarter. You peek into the parlor and see the merchant arrive, a polite smile on his face and an account book poking from his coat pocket. He nods. He calculates. He eats 2 scones and nods again. Your father says he's a prudent man. That means he doesn't gamble. That means he understands value. That means he will not marry for love, and neither will his son. You sit on the back steps, breathing in the scent of sun-warmed wood, and realize that affection has now entered the stock market. In this world, emotion must justify its cost. A fringe tidbit? In some Italian merchant cities, like Florence and Venice, dowries were often held in special trusts and could be recalled if the marriage dissolved, turning love into a conditional investment. Some women even loaned their own dowries to their husbands with interest, in effect becoming creditors in their own marriages. Historians still argue whether these arrangements protected women or merely extended the reach of male-controlled finance into every corner of domestic life. You spot your mother near the pantry, counting jars. She doesn't mention the meeting. She just mutters, "The merchant's son has good teeth." You know that's her way of saying he's acceptable, reliable, uninspiring, but also not terrible. And maybe in a world where bankruptcy destroys whole families, not terrible is a gift. You help slice bread for supper and overhear your father saying, "They'll make a steady pair. Not a happy pair, not a lively pair. Just steady." Because in this world, marriage isn't about fireworks, it's about sustainability. What happens when harvests fail, when shipping costs rise, when a war breaks out 3 countries away and suddenly dried cod is worth less than lint? That's when a steady pair proves valuable. But you still find yourself daydreaming, not about a ball or a dramatic kiss or even a runaway carriage. Just someone who looks at you and says, "I want this, not just because it makes sense, but because it makes my chest feel less empty." You glance across the market square and see a young couple laughing. They're poor. No dowries, no ledgers, just 2 baker's apprentices sharing a crust of bread and a joke. You envy them, even as you know their chances of long-term survival are slim. Because capitalism doesn't favor butterflies. You hear footsteps behind you and turn. It's the merchant's son. He's taller than you expected, nervous. He offers a fig half squashed. You take it. He says nothing poetic, just, "I'm told you so well my mother would like that." You nod, because what else do you do when affection has to compete with arithmetic? You return to your room and open the ledger again. Somewhere near the bottom, a note in your father's handwriting. Good match, stable income, predictable temperament, no debts, and beneath it, in your own hand, added just last night, "I don't feel anything." Then you erase it, because feelings don't go in ledgers. And ledgers, unfortunately, decide everything. You wake to a knock on the door, and not the kind that brings roses or declarations. No, this knock comes with papers and a smile that feels like a transaction. Because today, you learn how marriages were arranged not by passion or even logic, but by a deeply human force, meddling. Welcome to the realm of matchmakers, mothers, and meddlers, the unofficial army of marriage managers who saw love not as a mystery, but as a puzzle to be solved with careful placement of elbows, lace, and tea. You open the door and there she is, Aunt Hester, 5'2", smells like lavender and boiled onions. She's already halfway through telling you how you really must meet the tanner's second cousin's nephew who isn't much to look at, but plays the lute rather nicely. You haven't even had breakfast because in this world, marriage is too important to be left to chance. A mainstream historical fact. In 19th century Eastern Europe and many Jewish communities across the continent, professional shadchans, matchmakers, played essential roles in arranging marriages. They were paid not just in coin, but often in poultry, cloth, or community standing. A successful match wasn't a romantic achievement, it was a social victory. You sit in the parlour while Aunt Hester rearranges your posture, adjusts your collar, and tells you not to laugh with your nose crinkled. It makes you look too mischievous. Mischievous in her world means unmarriageable, and she's not the only one working on your future. Your mother's been casually asking about your preferred colours for a wedding garland. Your neighbour drops off extra eggs because she thinks they'll improve your complexion. Even your childhood friend has started talking about eligible tradesmen with the same intensity she once saved for gossip about rabbits. It's a community project, this whole marriage thing. You don't date, you get circulated. A fringe tidbit? In 18th century Japan, samurai and merchant families often used nakodo, go-betweens, to arrange marriages. These weren't just matchmakers, they were full-on facilitators, investigating backgrounds, incomes, family histories, and even personality temperaments. If the match failed later, the nakodo could be held personally responsible. Imagine being sued because your cousin turned out to be emotionally unavailable. Historians still debate whether these facilitators were truly neutral or if they pushed matches for personal gain. Either way, they had power. You try to excuse yourself to fetch firewood, but Aunt Hester follows. She says she once turned down a suitor because of how he sneezed. Too sudden, too untrustworthy. You're not sure what that means, but she says it like it's a known metric of marital success. You return to the parlour to find your mother has laid out a fresh gown, just in case anyone calls today. You know what that means. She's expecting someone, or she's invited someone, without telling you. Because in this world, being passive isn't laziness, it's strategy. To seem too eager is to seem improper. So you wait. And the meddlers do the moving for you. You might get lucky. One of them might actually know your soul better than you do. Or they might just be trying to pair you with anyone who has teeth and a roof. You hear footsteps, a knock, then voices. He's arrived. You don't know his name, but Aunt Hester does. She waves him in like a prized turkey at harvest. He bows. You curtsy. Your mother nods. The dog barks, and just like that, the wheels begin turning. He compliments the hearth. He sits stiffly. He asks if you enjoy knitting. You lie and say yes, because the alternative is explaining that you prefer long walks alone or writing letters you'll never send. And none of that fits neatly into a matchmaking plan. The visit ends politely. He leaves with a promise to return. And once the door closes, the review panel begins. Decent posture.
Clean fingernails. Didn't interrupt once. Bit quiet though, maybe shy. But his father owns 2 mills. Well, there you go. And with that, you've become a resume. You return to your room, alone, and find a note your sister slipped under your pillow. It reads, "Don't worry. If this one doesn't work out, we'll find someone else for you." A smiley face drawn beside it. It's meant to comfort. It doesn't. Because what you want, what you quietly long for, can't be arranged, managed, or introduced by committee. You want someone who doesn't arrive with a folder of references. You want someone who walks in, not because they were summoned, but because they couldn't stay away. But in this world, you get who they pick. And you learn to smile as though it was your idea all along. You wake to the sound of drawers opening and silk being smoothed across a bed frame. Your cousin is getting ready for something important, something stiff-collared, white-gloved, and deeply uncomfortable. A parlour visit, because today you're invited to observe the exquisite discomfort of the 19th century, where Victorian virtue squared off with passion, and romance was reined in with lace, posture, and painfully indirect conversation. This is not love at first sight. This is love as performance art. You sit quietly at the dressing table as your cousin fusses with her curls. Not too loose implies frivolity. Not too tight suggests control issues. Everything must be just romantic enough to seem innocent. Because in this world, passion is whispered, not shouted. Flirtation is a slight tilt of the head. Desire is expressed through preferred embroidery motifs. Anything more is scandal, a mainstream historical fact. In Victorian England, a woman's public reputation was everything. Her behaviour was scrutinised down to how tightly she cinched her gloves. If she laughed too freely, walked unchaperoned, or danced more than twice with the same man at a ball, her name could be whispered across drawing rooms for weeks. And that whisper, it could end her marriage prospects. So you learn the rules. You don't lean in, you don't touch, you speak with restraint always. If a man wishes to express interest, he might send you a flower or call at your home with a book he thinks you might enjoy. That's not just thoughtful, it's basically a proposal. You recall how your other cousin once sent back a bouquet because the gentleman included red roses, not white.
She said, too forward. He never called again. That's how fragile this courtship is. You join the parlour visit. The room is silent but tense, like a courtroom during a long pause. The suitor sits on one side, hands folded. Your cousin sits on the other, clasping a fan that might as well be a dagger. They discuss poetry, then weather, then, scandalously, art. At one point, his knee almost touches hers. She shifts slightly. Her chaperone coughs. A crisis is averted. This is how a generation fell in love, through a series of stifled gestures. A fringe tidbit? During the Victorian era, fans weren't just accessories, they were tools of covert communication. A woman could send signals through subtle movements. A closed fan meant, "I'm not interested." Tapping it on the chin meant, "I'm open to conversation." Holding it in the left hand signalled desire. Think of it as emotional Morse code in silk and whalebone. Historians still argue how many women knew these codes, and how many just flailed politely in the heat. After tea, your cousin asks you to stay behind. She says she's exhausted. From what? From sitting upright and trying not to seem too clever. From measuring each word like it's being weighed on a scale. She says, "I think I like him." You ask, "Really?" She says, "I like that he didn't correct me." In this world, that's a wild compliment, because men are supposed to lead, dominate, instruct. Women are supposed to smile, nod, agree. A man who listens without condescension, that's practically erotic. You walk home through the garden, past the hedgerow where once, years ago, you and your sister read Wuthering Heights aloud by candlelight. She said she wanted a love like Catherine and Heathcliff, but then she got older, and she realised Catherine would have been labelled mad, and Heathcliff would have been banned from every respectable ballroom in London. In real life, that kind of love gets you disinvited from society. So you settle for glances, for polite inquiries, for maybe, if you're lucky, a shared waltz that feels like a stolen kiss. But never an actual kiss. Not here, not yet. Not unless you're married. And even then, keep it tasteful. You close the garden gate and look back toward the parlour window. Your cousin is still seated, her fan resting beside her. She stares at the fire and her lips twitch slightly, maybe a smile, maybe regret. Because she knows what's expected, but deep down she also knows what's missing. Heat, laughter, freedom. But those things live in novels, in locked diaries, not in this prim, tight-laced world of good matches and gloved hands. And yet she'll marry him. Probably because he's polite, because he didn't correct her, because in a world where passion is suspicious, sometimes bare decency feels like fire. You wake to the sound of paper rustling, not love letters this time, but medical diagrams, because today you learn that even science wanted in on the matchmaking game. That's right. This morning, someone's trying to measure your skull, analyze your temperament, and decide whether your jawline indicates compatibility. Because welcome to the bizarre chapter of history when science tried to explain love. You sit up in bed and find a little pamphlet on your nightstand. The Scientific Method of Matrimonial Matching. You blink. Was this left by your uncle? He's been on a kick lately about measurable romance. Something about noses and nerves and how freckles might signal excess emotion. This, apparently, is progress, a mainstream historical fact. In the 19th century, phrenology, the pseudoscience of skull shape, gained popularity as a way to evaluate personality, morality, and even romantic potential. Matchmakers and scientific advisors would feel the bumps on your head and determine if you were ideal for marriage or doomed to inflict drama on your partner's delicate nervous system. You pull on your shawl and head downstairs. At the breakfast table, your aunt is reading an article aloud. Scientists say melancholic girls should avoid marrying choleric men. Everyone nods like this is obvious. You wonder what your temperament is. You're told you're sensitive, which in this household means prone to thinking too much. Better marry someone dull to balance it out. It's not just phrenology. By the late 1800s, early psychologists began devising compatibility charts based on everything from hand shape to eye movement to digestion. You sip your tea and imagine a future where marriage is arranged by quiz. Do you prefer dogs or cats? Do you cry at concerts? Do you sleep on your left side? Congratulations, you're a perfect match for the shoemaker's son who also enjoys pickled onions and has low cheekbones. A fringe tidbit? In 1919, an American magazine published one of the first scientific matchmaking services, a questionnaire that, when completed, would be analyzed by experts who would mail you a list of compatible suitors. Thousands of women applied. Some were matched, a few even married. Historians still argue whether the results were based on sound psychology or just well-worded guesswork. You head into the village, past the apothecary, where someone has posted a notice for a lecture titled The Chemistry of Affection, Why Some People Just Don't Smell Right. You consider going, just for the absurdity of it. Because for all its weirdness, there's something kind of sweet about this scientific meddling. It means people were trying to crack the code, trying to understand the invisible thread that ties one person to another. And yes, they got it wrong, repeatedly, hilariously, sometimes harmfully. But beneath all those bumps and charts and formulas was the same old question. Why do we choose the people we choose? You visit your cousin later that day. She's reading an article about eye color and emotional compatibility. Apparently, blue-eyed people are more submissive in conflict. You both laugh until your stomachs ache. She tells you that her suitor came back. He brought a book. This time, he asked her what she wanted to read. Not what she should read, what she liked. You say, that's practically scandalous. She says, I know, I think I love him. And for a moment it doesn't matter what shape her skull is or how quickly her pupils dilate when startled. None of that matters, because the only real science at play is this. Someone asked, and someone listened. Still, the family insists on having them evaluated, just to be sure. Some new fellow in town claims to have invented a love-o-meter. He charges 3p to take your pulse while you look at your beloved. If your heartbeat increases, he nods and says, "You're biologically aligned." You both plan to fake it, just for the story, because in a world where feelings are dismissed and love is feared, maybe measurable affection seems safer than the real thing, but you know the truth. No chart, no bump, no quiz can predict the way a heart opens. And sometimes all the logic in the world dissolves the moment someone brushes your hand and says your name like it matters. You wake to shouting in the street, not angry shouting, not the usual cart stuck in mud kind. This is the sharp, clear sound of voices in disagreement, measured, public, and absolutely scandalous. You creep to the window. Across the road, the baker's daughter is standing in the middle of the square, her hair unbraided, her apron damp with tears and flour. She's yelling at her husband in front of everyone, and no one is stopping her. Because today you learn what happens when the foundation cracks, when the duty sours, the tolerance fades, and one brave soul decides to say, "I want out." Today you learn about the rebellion of divorce and disgrace. You pull on your cloak and slip outside, pretending to carry onions, as one does in moments of social surveillance. A crowd gathers quickly. The baker has stormed back into his shop. His wife, soon to be ex maybe, follows him, still shouting. You hear phrases like, "I won't be quiet and I told you I'd leave," and perhaps the most blasphemous of all, "I deserve to be happy." Heads turn like she's just declared war, because in this world, leaving a marriage isn't just frowned upon, it's earthquake behavior, a mainstream historical fact. For most of European history, divorce was either illegal, nearly impossible, or socially ruinous. In Catholic countries, it simply didn't exist. Your only legal route out of marriage was annulment, and that required proving the marriage had been invalid from the start. No love lost, tough, no abuse, not the court's concern. Even in Protestant regions where divorce technically existed, the process was agonizing, and the burden of proof almost always fell on the wife. She had to prove neglect, impotence, desertion, or cruelty, and even if she won, her reputation was often unsalvageable. You pass the town scribe's office. There's a woman inside, hunched over a desk, signing papers with trembling hands. You know her. Her husband ran off with a seamstress 2 towns over. Everyone said she should just keep quiet and be patient. Instead, she filed for legal separation, which is not quite divorce, but it's something. And in this world, something is radical, a fringe tidbit. In 17th century Sweden, a woman could technically divorce her husband if she proved he'd been impotent, but only after enduring 2 years of supervised celibacy and official medical examinations. Imagine explaining that at a dinner party. Historians still argue whether early divorce laws empowered women or simply offered a different way to punish the same old transgressions. You round the corner and find a small crowd whispering outside the baker's shop. The shutters are drawn. The air smells of burnt rye and gossip. One woman mutters, "She'll never be respectable again." Another replies, "She was never that respectable to begin with." You wonder if the baker's wife can hear them. You hope she can't. But maybe, just maybe, she doesn't care anymore. Maybe that's what makes her dangerous, because in a world built on arranged matches, unequal contracts and silent suffering, a woman walking out is a thunderclap, and yet people do it, not many, not often, but enough to leave cracks in the wall, enough to plant the idea that love should not be coerced, that endurance is not the same as virtue, that happiness might be a valid reason to leave. You return home to find your sister reading a newspaper from the city. There's an article about a woman who published her own divorce memoir. She names names, lists grievances, describes in detail the year she spent pretending not to cry during dinner. Your sister's eyes are wide, not with horror, with hope, because for every woman who stays, there's one who runs, one who speaks, one who simply decides, "I'm done." And the consequences, they're steep. Divorced women are often shunned, ridiculed, written out of wills. Some are forced to return to their fathers' homes like misfired arrows. Others turn to work, teaching, midwifery, laundry. Any form of independence that doesn't require a man's signature. But there are always a few, just a few, who carve out new lives, quiet ones, fierce ones. You lie in bed that night, thinking of the baker's wife, wondering if she'll sleep alone in her shop now or with a friend, if someone will bring her bread in the morning, if the town will ever say her name with respect again. And you think, maybe it doesn't matter, maybe saying enough is its own kind of grace. You wake to the sound of bells, church bells, not wedding bells, though sometimes in this world they ring for both. Because today you step into the quiet revolution of marrying for love, that strange, risky, thrilling notion that didn't become truly acceptable until scandalously late in the historical game. You stretch, rise, and peer out the window. Across the street, a young couple walks arm in arm. They're not accompanied, no chaperone, no aunt whispering, no parental contract hanging in the air like a muslin veil, just the two of them, smiling. Choosing, you blink, because this is new, this is modern, a mainstream historical fact. For most of recorded history, romantic love was not considered a suitable basis for marriage. It was suspicious, dangerous, associated with lust, madness, even heresy. Love was the stuff of troubadours and poetry, of stories meant to warn you, not guide you. Real marriages were forged with property, class, and duty in mind. But by the late 18th century, something began to shift. Enlightenment thinkers started promoting the idea of individual happiness, and novels, glorious, dangerous novels, spread ideas about marrying for affection, compatibility, and the occasional soul connection. Jane Austen didn't invent the idea, but she gave it structure, language, and corsets. You step outside, book in hand, and head toward the orchard path. There, beneath the bent boughs, you see another couple, laughing. Actually laughing. She throws a plum. He dodges. They kiss. You feel like you're witnessing mild rebellion, because even now, love is a negotiation. Your aunt still says things like, you can't live on romance, and shared values matter more than fluttery feelings. But you suspect she once had a flutter or two herself. A fringe tidbit? In early 19th century France, some parents began quietly supporting their children's love matches, but only if the suitor was still financially viable. A poor poet? No. A slightly boring merchant's son who wrote tolerable verse? Acceptable. Love? Yes, but love with a spreadsheet. Historians still argue whether the rise of love-based marriage was driven by philosophy, economics, or the sheer exhaustion of pretending otherwise. You find your sister in the garden, scribbling in her journal. She says she's writing a list of qualities she wants in a husband. So far it includes kindness, good teeth, ability to carry large baskets, someone who listens when she talks about birds. You ask if she's written about property or family, standing. She says, ugh, that too, I guess. Progress comes in teaspoons. Later that afternoon, a travelling theatre troupe performs a scene from Romeo and Juliet in the square. Your mother frowns. Not appropriate, she mutters. They both die. But the younger girls sit with rapt faces, sighing as Romeo climbs the ladder. It doesn't matter that the ending is tragic. What matters is that they chose, they defied, escaped, exploded, all for love. And though they paid for it, they paid together. That's the dream, not just romance, but mutual choosing. Even if the system still wants its say, because this new love marriage trend, it doesn't mean freedom from pressure. It just changes the flavor. Now, instead of being matched by your family, you're expected to find someone yourself. And if you don't, it's seen as a personal failing. You trade arranged courtships for dating. You trade contracts for confusion. And sometimes you trade security for spark. You remember your cousin's wedding last summer. Everyone said they were perfect. Similar interests, complementary temperaments, sensible finances. But you noticed her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. And a year later she confessed, I thought it was love, but it was just approval. Now she writes poetry about escape. She keeps it under her mattress, because marrying for love, as radical as it sounds, doesn't guarantee anything. It just opens the door, and that door, it can lead to joy, or chaos, or mediocrity in a romantic hat. But at least you get to choose. You lie in bed that night and imagine a world where love was always part of marriage, where no one had to ask permission to feel what they felt, where "I want to be with you" didn't require strategy, permission slips, or bloodline diagrams, a world where hearts were trusted, even when they misfired. And maybe, just maybe, we're getting closer to that world, plum by plum, smile by smile, choice by trembling, terrifying, magnificent choice. You wake to a question that has traveled centuries to land softly on your chest. It's not who do you love, it's do you need to love anyone at all? Because today you'll peer into the quiet, rarely lit corners of history, the ones where people chose no one and were judged for it, feared for it, or sometimes quietly envied. Today is about those who never married. You pull on your robe and wander toward the garden. The world feels softer this morning, as if holding its breath. The roses are blooming aggressively as if they have something to prove, but you just sit, inhale, and wonder what it would have been like if choosing not to marry had always been an option. Spoiler, it wasn't. A mainstream historical fact. For most of history, singleness was not just strange, it was seen as suspicious or tragic, or both. Women especially were expected to marry by a certain age. If they didn't, they were pitied at best, ridiculed at worst. The term spinster wasn't just descriptive, it was sharp, soaked in implication. Men had slightly more leeway, especially if they had money or scholarly ambitions. But even then, a bachelor was often assumed to be hiding something: poverty, illness, deviance, or worse, a disinterest in legacy, because in this world, not reproducing was an act of defiance. You recall your great-aunt, the one who lived in a little cottage by the sea. She was unmarried, smoked clove cigarettes, read long novels, and kept chickens with names like Matilda and Geoffrey. The family always called her eccentric, but once, when you visited her alone, she looked over her cup and said, "I had offers, I just preferred quiet." And that somehow was more rebellious than all the love affairs in Paris. A fringe tidbit? In Renaissance Venice, certain convents became unofficial refugees for women who wanted out of the marriage game. These weren't always religious choices. Some women joined for the solitude, the education, or simply to avoid being bartered into unpleasant unions. One abbess famously said, "Our silence is sweeter than any husband's praise." Historians still argue whether these convents empowered women or simply offered gilded cages with better lighting. You stroll past the apothecary where someone has chalked the phrase "better alone than mismatched" on the stoop. It's already smudged by boot prints, but the sentiment lingers. In the square, a woman sells ribbons and herbs. She's well into her 40s, unmarried, and everyone calls her Miss. Not Madam, never Mistress, just Miss. Like her name is frozen in social suspense, but she smiles, sings, goes home to her own bed, wakes when she wants, and no one weeps when she forgets to put on her bonnet. Later that day, you find an old pamphlet in the attic titled "The Perils of Remaining Unwed." It lists such dangers as melancholy, excessive wit, over-fondness for cats, impractical gardening. You laugh so hard you knock over a box of curtain rings, because maybe, just maybe, the reason society feared unmarried people was because they looked too free, unburdened by obligation, untethered by compromise, unclaimed, unspent, and unapologetically whole. You return to the garden where your cousin is trimming roses. She talks about her upcoming wedding. "It's fine," she says. "He's kind." They agree on wallpaper. You ask if she's excited. She says, "I think so," then adds quietly, "I just hope I still feel like myself." And there it is, that quiet fear that marriage, even the love-based kind, sometimes swallows the individual whole. So tonight, before bed, you light a candle and write a letter to your future self. You promise her 3 things: that you'll never apologize for wanting love, that you'll never apologize for not wanting it either, and that if you ever find someone who makes you more you, not less, hold them gently, but not at the cost of your name, because there's a strength in staying. But there's also a fierce, glowing strength in not. You wake to the smell of smoke, not fire, but incense, thick, sweet, and unfamiliar. It lingers in the air like a question. Because today you wander far beyond the drawing rooms and dowries. Today you learn that not every culture treated marriage and love the way yours did. Today you step into the world of global love traditions, where rules are different, rituals stranger, and choices, sometimes even freer. You rise slowly, as if slipping into another skin, and open a dusty trunk at the foot of your bed. Inside, scarves embroidered with silver thread, a tiny carved box of betel nuts, and a scroll written in a language you don't understand. A wedding gift from someone else's wedding, in someone else's world. A mainstream historical fact? While medieval Europe clung tightly to marriage as an economic arrangement, many other cultures experimented with looser, more flexible models of partnership. In parts of ancient Egypt, marriage was informal, often sealed with mutual agreement and later documented if needed. In some indigenous American societies, divorce was a matter of walking away with your things. In Tibet, a system called polyandry allowed one woman to marry multiple brothers. In some regions of West Africa, same-sex marriages between women were recorded, not romantic in a modern sense perhaps, but economically and socially recognized. You wrap a scarf around your shoulders and step into the imaginary marketplace of world customs. Everywhere, banners flutter. You pass a tent where women in India paint one another's hands with henna, each design a prayer, a wish, a protection. Just beside them, a Ghanaian mother lays out kente cloth patterns for her daughter's engagement. Each thread, a language, the colors speak before the mouths do. Nearby, a Mongolian couple drinks fermented mare's milk as part of their union ceremony. You gag a little, but they laugh at you mostly. A fringe tidbit? In certain regions of 16th century China, ghost marriages were held to wed two deceased individuals, or to marry a living person to a dead one, so family lines could remain intact. Imagine falling in love and being told your spouse has been dead for 15 years, and still outranks you. Historians still argue whether these customs reflected social cohesion or deep anxiety about lineage and ancestral honor. Back in your garden, you imagine your relatives reacting to these stories. Your uncle would cough and change the subject. Your grandmother would whisper a prayer. Your cousin might say, "Well, sounds less exhausting than our weddings." Because maybe what unsettles people most is that love doesn't have a universal definition. For every culture that demanded monogamy, another allowed visiting spouses. For every society that enforced arranged marriage, another honored courtship songs, nighttime serenades, or trial periods where two people simply tried. Even today, remnants of those systems survive. In rural Indonesia, the Ngundumantu ceremony invites the groom's family into the bride's world, flipping the script. In the Mosuo communities of China, romantic partners may never live together at all. They visit nightly, return to their own homes at dawn, and raise children in maternal households. You picture yourself in that system. No in-laws, no merged kitchens, just a quiet tap at your window each night, and a choice every morning to continue or not. Strange? Maybe. But so is falling in love with someone based on a bloodline contract. You lie back down and watch the dusk filter through the curtain. And you realize the way your culture shaped marriage, duty first, desire second, wasn't inevitable. It was just one path through the forest. There are hundreds, some soft, some wild, some ridiculous, some tender. And in each, people tried to answer the same aching question. How do we bind ourselves to one another, and why? You wake to the scent of ink and cheap paper. Someone has left a pamphlet on your doorstep. The title, scrawled in bold letters, reads, "Love is a Lie, a Cautionary Treatise for Modern Youth." You sigh. You haven't had coffee yet, and already you're being warned. Because today you stroll into the age when love finally won the public stage, when it became the default, not the exception, but also when it became, well, commodified. Welcome to the long, glittering, chaotic era of romantic idealism and its discontents. You settle into your favorite chair, pamphlet in hand. It's full of dramatic statements like passion fades, marriage is a trap, and never trust a man who quotes poetry. You're only mildly offended because in a way it's not wrong. A mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, love-based marriage had become the dominant expectation across much of the Western world. People were no longer marrying because their parents told them to, or because land needed uniting, or because their priest brokered it. They were marrying because they were in love, or believed they were. The age of the romantic novel had spilled into real life. Young women clutched dog-eared copies of Wuthering Heights and Anna Karenina, sighing at all the worst possible men. Young men memorized Byron and thought brooding was a personality. But love, it turned out, didn't come with instructions. And many soon discovered that marrying for love didn't protect you from disappointment, drudgery, or dull Tuesdays. You pass by the general store and peek through the glass. Inside, a new invention glows behind the counter, the greeting card, rows and rows of printed affections, pre-written sentiment in flowery fonts. Love repackaged. Your town now sells romance in envelopes. A fringe tidbit? In the 1920s, several American advice columns began warning readers about the love delusion, the idea that emotional compatibility alone was enough to sustain a marriage. Shared toothbrush cups do not guarantee shared values, one wrote. Another quipped, even Romeo would forget to take out the trash. Historians still argue whether the rise of love marriages liberated society or simply introduced new pressures, forcing people to search endlessly for a feeling that might never come or might not last. You stop by the post office. A wall is covered in classified ads, looking for a kind man who doesn't mind silence. Seeking a wife who enjoys farming and tolerates sarcasm. Please write with a photo and your favorite soup. Some of these people will find something real. Some will find a quiet companionship. Some will ghost each other before the second letter, because once love became a choice, it also became a marketplace. Dating agencies appeared, matrimonial ads filled newspapers, eventually websites, then apps. Swipe left, swipe right, swipe into the void. You walk past the town theatre, where a movie poster boasts, "They fell in love." Then it all went wrong. You wonder if that's a spoiler or just the default trajectory. Because now, love is expected to do everything. It's supposed to be fulfilling, sexy, equal, supportive, exciting, healing, safe, and surprising. All at once. It's a miracle we even try. But we do, again and again, even when it hurts. Even when it fizzles, even when the greeting card doesn't arrive, or the movie ends too soon. You lie in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, and realize something quietly radical. Marrying for love was never the problem. Expecting love to solve you might be. So maybe, just maybe, the next evolution of love isn't bigger feelings, louder proposals, or diamond rings the size of plums. Maybe it's this, a deep breath, a shared breakfast, a partner who holds the ladder while you prune the fig tree. Someone who listens when you say, "I'm scared," and replies, "I'm here." Not a fairy tale, just a promise. And maybe that's more than enough. You wake to silence. Not the silence of loneliness or tension or awkward breakfast pauses. This silence feels like space, like permission. Because today you walk slowly into the most recent chapter of love's strange, stubborn history. A chapter still being written. Today you enter the age of choice. Real choice. The kind that says, marry, don't marry late, marry often, marry no one. Marry someone you met on a mountain while chasing goats. The kind that says, you get to decide. It's a lot to carry. But also, finally, a kind of freedom. You sit up and stretch. Your phone buzzes. A reminder. Anniversary of the legalization of same-sex marriage. You blink, rub your eyes, and remember this only happened a heartbeat ago. A mainstream historical fact. In the United States, same-sex marriage wasn't federally legalized until 2015. Just a decade earlier, it was still banned in most states. Globally, dozens of countries still forbid it. So while marrying for love is now the assumed norm, it wasn't always an available option for everyone. You wander into the kitchen. On the fridge, magnets hold up wedding invitations from all kinds of couples. The lesbian florists who eloped in Vermont. The single dad remarrying after 20 years. Your childhood friend and his partner of 15 years, who finally tied the knot last spring under a weeping willow. There's more variety now, more colour, more room. But also more questions, because, freedom brings confusion. And now, instead of asking, when will you marry, people ask, why haven't you? Why did you again? Why them? Are you sure? Modern love is a puzzle with extra pieces. No edge pieces, no box. A fringe tidbit? In Iceland, a popular dating app warns users if they're related. Yep. In such a small population, there's a real chance you might accidentally flirt with your third cousin. The app sends a bump alert if you're too closely matched. Awkward? Yes. Helpful? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether modern romantic independence is the culmination of centuries of progress, or just a more personalized form of pressure, because now you're responsible for your own heartbreak. No dowry, no matchmaking aunt, no bartering priest, just you. Your decisions, your courage, your capacity to risk everything for someone whose socks you'll one day despise. You pass by the park and see a trio of retirees having champagne and cake. One of them is wearing a sash. Finally married at 78. You want to cry and laugh at once. Because here's the truth. The longer we wait to allow people to love freely, the more joy we delay. But the joy still comes, eventually. Sometimes with grey hair and creaky knees, and sometimes it doesn't come. Some people live their entire lives without the kind of love books are written about. Some try and try and try again. Some quietly decide they'd rather adopt a dog and learn French, and that's okay too. Because love, like sleep, doesn't follow a timetable. It visits you when it wants to. And if it doesn't, you can still make a life out of laughter, lavender tea, warm socks, and the knowledge that you were never anyone's compromise. Tonight, as you light a candle by your window, you whisper one last toast to the lovers, the loners, the late bloomers, the divorced, the remarried, the skipped, the ghosted, the widowed, the poly, the ace, the quietly content, the perpetually searching. May they all rest easy in the knowledge that there's no wrong answer anymore, just different paths, different beds, different kinds of peace. You wake slowly, as if the air itself is tucking you back in. No alarms, no noise, just the hush of early morning, grey light seeping through linen curtains, the distant murmur of traffic, and the warm weight of your blanket keeping the world at bay for a few more precious minutes. You breathe in, because tonight, yes, we're calling this night again, even if you're sneaking in a midday nap, you reach the end of this winding, wonderful, wildly illogical journey through the history of love, marriage, and all the tangled threads in between. You stretch your arms and remember, this didn't start with you. It started thousands of years ago, in fields, in palaces, in marketplaces, in caves, with someone asking someone else, should we do this thing together? And then everything else followed. The deals, the dresses, the dowries, the heartbreak, the bans, the ballads, the royal decrees, the scandals, the laws, the lawsuits, the pamphlets, the sighs in candlelight, the long pauses at the altar, the quiet divorces, the remarriages, the anniversaries no one remembered, and the breakfasts that tasted like hope. A mainstream historical fact. Marriage has never been one thing. It has shifted shape with each century, culture, and political whim. It has been used to forge empires and to crush freedom. It has been whispered about behind fans and screamed about in courtrooms. And yet, here it is. Still. Not always necessary, not always fair, but always human. You pour a cup of tea and gaze out the window. Somewhere, someone is proposing. Someone else is packing up and leaving. Someone's getting ghosted. Someone's falling unexpectedly in love with a friend they've known forever. The world doesn't pause for your heart, but it does make space for it. A fringe tidbit? In 2021, a woman in Japan held a wedding ceremony to marry her favorite fictional character. No, really. Guests came, vows were exchanged. She said she'd never felt more seen. Historians still argue whether the future of marriage lies in radical reinvention or gentle decay, but as you settle deeper into the mattress, maybe that doesn't matter so much right now, because you've wandered through thousands of years of longing, tradition, rebellion, velvet gloves, iron contracts, whispered promises, and awkward blind dates. You've seen why people married for duty, why they risked everything for love, why they chose no one, why they chose themselves, and through it all you never stopped listening. So tonight, let your mind quiet, let the drama drift away like tulle on a breeze, let the debate rest. You've earned that, and whether you wake tomorrow in someone's arms or stretch alone under your favorite quilt, may you know this: you are complete, you are curious, you are part of a story much older than you, and yet uniquely yours. Let your breath slow now. There's nothing more to decide, nothing more to understand. The past has unspooled itself gently before you, and the questions that once pressed hard against your ribs have softened like old paper in warm hands. The night wraps you up, not in lace or vows, but in stillness, in the low hum of history fading into dreams. Outside, a breeze moves through the trees, the same wind that once rustled bridal veils in ancient Rome, that carried laughter across Scottish moors, that whispered through barred convent windows. It brushes your cheek now, as soft as a sigh. Your room feels still, but not empty. It is full of echoes of ancient flutes and church bells, market banter and first kisses, courtroom oaths and quiet goodbyes, of everything that came before you and everything you carry forward. You don't have to remember it all. Just rest in the knowledge that you've wandered far, asked big questions, and let the answers shift like shadows. No one gets love right, but oh, how beautifully we try. Now tuck your fingers beneath the blanket, close your eyes. There's nowhere else to be, no one else to become. Not right now, just you this moment and the faint memory of a world that once insisted love could be measured. It never could. Good night.